Welcome to the end of the world again. Hey guys, welcome to the Quiet Past historical channel. Tonight we're diving into something a little different. Grab your blanket, dim those lights, maybe put your phone on silent, because we're about to spend the next few hours talking about disease, death, and the absolutely wild ways people just dealt with it. And I mean really dealt with it. No panic buying toilet paper, no doom scrolling Twitter, just quiet acceptance, a lot of praying, and occasionally some truly bizarre medical advice. Now, before we get too far, let's clear something up. When we talk about medieval plagues in America, we're not talking about the actual medieval period because, well, Europeans hadn't even shown up yet. What we're really exploring here is how epidemic diseases that had their roots in medieval understanding, medieval medicine, and medieval chaos eventually made their way across the Atlantic and absolutely devastated populations that had zero immunity, zero preparation, and frankly, zero chance. We're going to walk through the arrival of smallpox, typhus, measles, and a whole parade of other microscopic horrors that turned the so-called New World into a graveyard. We'll talk about how indigenous populations faced these diseases with dignity, even as their entire worlds collapsed. We'll get into the colonial period, when European settlers brought their plagues right along with their Bibles and land deeds. And we'll explore how people in early America just kept going, kept farming, kept having babies, kept building towns on top of mass graves, because what else were you going to do? So settle in. This is going to be long, it's going to be dark, and it's going to be weirdly calm, because that's how history actually happens. Not with dramatic music and slow motion scenes, but with people waking up, finding half their village dead, and then making breakfast anyway. Let's start at the beginning, or at least one version of it. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't just bring ships, sailors, and an absolutely unearned sense of confidence. He brought diseases. Smallpox, typhus, influenza, measles. Things that had been bouncing around Europe, Asia, and Africa for centuries, killing people sure, but also creating populations with at least some level of immunity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had none of that. They'd been isolated for thousands of years, living in complex societies, building cities, developing agriculture, and generally doing just fine without any exposure to Eurasian plagues. So when those diseases arrived, they didn't just spread, they obliterated. Smallpox is usually the star of this horror show, and for good reason. It was incredibly contagious. It killed about 30% of the people who caught it, and the ones who survived were often left blind or badly scarred. But here's the thing that made it truly catastrophic in the Americas. It spread fast, it spread far, and it spread before Europeans even showed up in many places. Indigenous trade networks were extensive. A disease could leap from the Caribbean to Central America to North America without a single Spanish soldier setting foot there. People were dying in cities the Europeans didn't even know existed yet. The Taino people of Hispaniola, where Columbus first landed, were among the first to experience this. Within a few decades, their population dropped from potentially millions to mere thousands. And it wasn't just smallpox. It was a cascade of diseases hitting one after another, each one finding a population weakened by the last. Influenza would sweep through, then measles, then typhus. There was no time to recover, no time to rebuild, just wave after wave of sickness. And here's where it gets particularly grim. The Europeans noticed. They absolutely noticed. Some of them saw it as divine intervention, proof that God wanted them to take this land. Others saw it as a strategic advantage, and in some cases, actively weaponized disease. There are documented instances of British officers during the French and Indian War discussing giving smallpox-infected blankets to Native American tribes. Whether this actually happened in a widespread way is still debated by historians. But the fact that they were even talking about it tells you everything you need to know about the mindset. But let's talk about how people actually faced this, because that's what we're here for, right? The quiet, terrible, everyday reality of living through a plague. In many indigenous communities, when smallpox hit, people didn't have a framework for understanding it. They had medicine, of course, sophisticated knowledge of herbs, treatments, spiritual practices, but nothing in their experience prepared them for a disease that spread this fast and killed this efficiently. Some communities interpreted it as a spiritual attack and tried traditional healings. Others quarantined the sick, which sometimes helped and sometimes just meant people died alone. What strikes me reading accounts from this period is the lack of panic in many cases. Not because people weren't terrified, but because panic doesn't actually help when everyone around you is dying. You still have to bury the dead. You still have to care for the sick. You still have to find food, protect your children, maintain some semblance of order. So people did. They performed rituals. They sang. They held each other. And they died quietly because there was no other choice. European observers often commented on this with a kind of detached curiosity. They'd write about how the Indians faced death with stoicism, as if it were some inherent cultural trait rather than the only possible response to absolute catastrophe. It's easier to romanticize people's suffering than to sit with the reality that you're watching an entire civilization collapse and doing nothing to stop it, or worse, actively benefiting from it. By the time the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, they were walking into a graveyard. A plague, probably smallpox or possibly leptospirosis, had torn through the local Wampanoag population just a few years earlier. Whole villages were abandoned. Cornfields were going to seed with no one to harvest them. The Pilgrims saw this as providence. They literally gave thanks to God for clearing the land for them. They moved into abandoned homes, used cleared fields, and built their colony on top of the bones of the people who died there. And the Wampanoag who survived, they were dealing with their own apocalypse. Massasoit, their leader, made an alliance with the Pilgrims, partly out of pragmatism. His people were weakened, vulnerable to rival tribes, and these strange newcomers had weapons and potential as allies. It's one of history's bleakest ironies that the cooperation that led to the first Thanksgiving was born out of demographic collapse caused by European diseases. Let's drift over to New Spain for a moment, because the scale of death there is almost incomprehensible. The Aztec Empire, at its height, had a population estimated between 5 and 15 million people. By 1600, less than a century after Spanish contact, the indigenous population of central Mexico had dropped to about 1 million. 1 million. That's not a decline. That's an annihilation. Smallpox hit first, arriving in 1520 during the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan. It killed the Aztec emperor, Cuitlahuac, along with a huge portion of the population. The Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, were initially driven out of the city in what's called La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. But when they came back, they found a city weakened by disease. Bodies were piling up faster than they could be buried. The social order was fracturing, and the Spanish walked back in and took over. But smallpox was just the opening act. In 1545, a disease the Aztecs called coccolysly swept through. We're still not entirely sure what it was. Some researchers think it was a hemorrhagic fever, possibly spread by rodents during a drought. Others think it might have been typhus, or a form of viral hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola. What we do know is that it killed an estimated 5 to 15 million people in the span of a few years. People described bleeding from the eyes, ears, and mouth, high fevers, delirium, death within days. Spanish colonists were terrified, even though they seemed to be less affected than the indigenous population, possibly due to some partial immunity, or just because they were living in slightly less crowded conditions. The response was, again, a kind of quiet endurance mixed with desperation. Priests performed last rites en masse. Families buried their dead in shallow graves, or sometimes just left bodies in homes and fled. Markets shut down. Agriculture collapsed. Social fabric of entire regions disintegrated. And yet somehow, people kept going. Survivors rebuilt communities, intermarried, adapted to Spanish colonial rule because the alternative was extinction. And here's the thing that really gets me. The Spanish colonial administrators documented all of this. They kept records, wrote letters, filed reports. They noted the population decline because it affected their tax, revenue, and labor supply. They didn't see it as a humanitarian catastrophe. They saw it as an economic problem. Fewer indigenous people meant fewer workers for the mines and plantations, so they started importing enslaved Africans to make up the difference, which of course brought even more diseases into the mix. It's layers of horror all the way down. Now, let's float up to North America and talk about the Puritan experience with plague, because they had their own special relationship with disease and death. The Puritans, bless their anxious hearts, saw illness as both a physical reality and a spiritual test. When someone got sick, it was because God was either punishing them for sin or refining them through suffering. Either way, your job was to accept it with grace, examine your soul, and pray for mercy. Complaining was seen as a lack of faith. So people died quietly, often surrounded by family and community, reciting Bible verses and making peace with their fate. Smallpox hit the Massachusetts Bay Colony repeatedly throughout the 1600s. In 1633, a major outbreak killed thousands of indigenous people in the region and a smaller, but still significant number of colonists. The Puritan minister Increase Mather, father of the even more famous Cotton Mather, wrote extensively about these outbreaks. He saw them as divine judgment against the heathen Indians and as a warning to the colonists to remain pious. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean depressing. The Puritans didn't have effective medical treatments for smallpox. No one did. So they relied on a combination of prayer, quarantine, and what they called receipts, which were basically folk remedies passed down through families. Some of these were harmless, like herbal teas. Others were actively dangerous, like bloodletting or inducing vomiting to purge the disease. When someone in a Puritan household got smallpox, the family would often quarantine themselves voluntarily. They'd hang a red flag outside the house to warn others away. Neighbors would leave food and supplies at the door. The sick person would be cared for by family members who'd already survived smallpox and were therefore immune. And if they died, which they often did, the body would be buried quickly, often at night, to minimize the risk of spreading the disease. There's something almost ritualistic about it. The quiet acceptance, the community care, the sense that you were participating in a cosmic drama where your suffering had meaning, even if that meaning was just, God is testing me and I better pass. Cotton Mather, Increase's son, would later become a controversial figure during the smallpox outbreak of 1721 because he advocated for inoculation, which was a precursor to vaccination. He'd learned about it from an enslaved man named Onesimus, who told him about the practice in West Africa. The idea was simple. You took pus from a smallpox sore and scratched it into a healthy person's skin. They'd usually get a mild case of smallpox and then be immune for life. It worked, but people absolutely hated it. They thought it was unnatural, that it was playing God, that it went against divine will. Mather's house was firebombed. He received death threats, but he kept pushing for it because the math was undeniable. Inoculated people died at a rate of about 2%, while people who caught smallpox naturally died at a rate of about 15 to 30%. Eventually, inoculation became more accepted, but it took decades and a lot of dead bodies to get there. People are slow to change, even when the evidence is overwhelming, especially when the evidence is overwhelming, actually, because admitting you were wrong means admitting that people died unnecessarily, and that's a hard thing to sit with. Let's take a moment to talk about yellow fever, because it deserves its own special circle of hell in this discussion. Yellow fever is a viral disease spread by mosquitoes, and it was an absolute nightmare in colonial America, particularly in port cities and the South. It causes high fever jaundice, which turns your skin yellow, hence the name, vomiting, bleeding, and in severe cases, organ failure. The mortality rate could reach 50% in some outbreaks. The thing about yellow fever is that it was most deadly to newcomers. People who grew up in areas where yellow fever was endemic often developed immunity as children, usually by getting a mild case. But European immigrants, sailors, and soldiers, they'd arrive in places like Charleston, Savannah, or New Orleans, and within weeks they'd be dead. There's a reason the Caribbean and the American South were called the white man's graveyard. It wasn't hyperbole. Entire regiments of British soldiers died of yellow fever during campaigns in the Caribbean. Colonial governors would serve a few months and then succumb to the disease. Merchants, settlers, indentured servants, nobody was safe. And the response? Again, quiet endurance mixed with absolutely useless medical treatments. Doctors in the 18th century thought yellow fever was caused by miasma, bad air rising from swamps and rotting matter. So they'd recommend avoiding swamps, burning tar or gunpowder to purify the air, and taking various tonics and purges. None of it worked because they didn't understand that mosquitoes were the vector. They wouldn't figure that out until the late 1800s. During outbreaks, people would flee cities if they could afford to. The wealthy would pack up and head to the countryside until the epidemic burned itself out. The poor stayed behind, either because they had no choice or because they'd already survived yellow fever and were immune. This created a kind of class divide around disease that would persist for centuries. If you were rich, you could escape plagues. If you were poor, you just had to endure them. Philadelphia's yellow fever epidemic of 1793 is particularly well documented, and it gives us a window into how people faced mass death in early America. The city was the nation's capital at the time, and in the summer of 1793, yellow fever arrived, probably via infected mosquitoes on a ship from the Caribbean. At first, people didn't realize what was happening. A few people got sick, a few died, but that was normal for summer in a crowded city. Then the deaths accelerated. 10 a day, then 20, then 50. Panic set in, which is the opposite of the quiet endurance we've been talking about. But stay with me, because it gets calm again in a really dark way. People fled. An estimated 20,000 of the city's 50,000 residents left within weeks. The federal government relocated to New Jersey. Shops closed. Streets emptied. The only people left were those too poor to leave, those caring for the sick, and those who'd already survived yellow fever. The free black community of Philadelphia, led by figures like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, stepped up to care for the sick and bury the dead. They'd been told by a prominent doctor, Benjamin Rush, that black people were immune to yellow fever. This was completely false, but they believed it and volunteered anyway. Hundreds of black Philadelphians died caring for white patients who would never have given them the time of day under normal circumstances. And here's where we get back to that quiet acceptance. Once it became clear that fleeing didn't guarantee safety, and that the epidemic would run its course no matter what, people just settled into it. They cared for their neighbors. They buried the dead. They kept whatever businesses and services running that they could. Carts rolled through the streets each morning to collect bodies. Bring out your dead, just like in Monty Python, except this was real and nobody was laughing. By November, when the first frost killed the mosquitoes, the epidemic ended. Over 5,000 people had died, about 10% of the city's population. And then everyone just came back and resumed their lives, because what else were you going to do? We need to talk about malaria for a minute, because it was probably the single most persistent killer in colonial and early America. And yet, it rarely gets the dramatic attention of plague or smallpox. Malaria is caused by a parasite transmitted by mosquitoes, and it causes recurring fevers, chills, anemia, and in severe cases, organ failure and death. It's not as immediately dramatic as smallpox or yellow fever, but it grinds people down over time. Chronic malaria saps your strength, makes you vulnerable to other diseases, reduces life expectancy, and in children, causes long-term developmental problems. The southern colonies and later states were absolutely riddled with malaria. It was so common that people just called it the ague or intermittent fever and considered it a normal part of life. You got malaria. You suffered through the chills and fever for a few days, and then you went back to work until the next time it flared up, and the next, and the next. People treated it with cinchona bark, which contains quinine, a genuinely effective anti-malarial drug. Indigenous people in South America had known about cinchona for centuries, and Jesuit missionaries brought it to Europe in the 1600s. It became known as Jesuit's bark and was one of the few actually useful medicines available at the time. But here's the thing. Even with treatment, malaria was everywhere. It shaped settlement patterns, agricultural practices, labor systems. The swampy lowlands of South Carolina and Georgia were perfect for growing rice, but they were also perfect for breeding mosquitoes. So plantation owners imported enslaved Africans, partly because some West African populations had genetic resistance to malaria, which made them more valuable as laborers in malarial regions. It's one of the most casually evil aspects of the slave trade. People were literally selected for enslavement based on their ability to survive in disease environments that would kill Europeans. And then they were worked to death anyway, just more slowly. The quiet acceptance of malaria as a fact of life is honestly stunning when you read about it. People would write letters mentioning that they'd had a touch of the fever. In the same tone, they'd mention the weather. Children grew up expecting to get malaria every summer. Women factored it into their family planning because they knew pregnancy and malaria together could be deadly. There's a letter from a Virginia planter in the 1700s where he casually mentions that 3 of his children died of the fever that summer. And then he transitions immediately into talking about the tobacco crop. Not because he didn't care, but because prolonged grief was a luxury. People died. You buried them. You kept going. Let's drift over to tuberculosis, or as they called it, consumption. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that primarily affects the lungs, causing a chronic cough, weight loss, night sweats, and eventually death. It was the leading cause of death in Europe and America from the 1600s through the early 1900s, killing roughly 1 in 4 people. The thing about TB is that it's slow. You could be sick for years, wasting away gradually, coughing up blood, losing weight until you were just skin and bones. It was called consumption because it seemed to consume you from the inside out, and people just lived with it because there was no cure, no treatment, nothing you could do except rest, eat well if you could afford it, and hope. Some people recovered spontaneously. Most didn't. There was a romanticization of tuberculosis in the 18th and 19th centuries that's really disturbing when you think about it. Pale skin, delicate features, a fragile beauty, these were associated with consumption and became fashionable. Poets and artists died of TB and were celebrated for their tragic deaths. It was seen as a disease of sensitive, artistic souls, which is nonsense, of course. TB didn't care if you were sensitive or artistic. It infected people who lived in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, which meant it was primarily a disease of the urban poor. But the wealthy who caught it could afford to retreat to sanitariums in the mountains or the countryside, where clean air and rest sometimes helped. The poor just died in tenements. The quiet acceptance of TB was different from the terror of plague or yellow fever. It was a slow, familiar enemy. Families would care for consumptive relatives for years, knowing the outcome was almost certainly death, but not knowing when. People would make wills, put their affairs in order, say their goodbyes, and then sometimes linger for months or years longer. There's something almost meditative about the pace of it, in a grim way. No sudden panic, no desperate flight, just the slow recognition that your body was failing, and there was nothing anyone could do about it except keep you comfortable. I want to take a moment to talk about how indigenous communities specifically faced these waves of disease, because their experience was distinct and deserves its own attention. For many Native American tribes, epidemic disease didn't just kill people. It destroyed the social and cultural fabric of entire communities. Elders who held oral histories died before they could pass them on. Healers who knew traditional medicines died before they could train apprentices. Leaders, warriors, mothers, children, whole generations wiped out in the span of a few years. And yet, communities survived. They adapted. They merged with other tribes. They adopted new practices, incorporated new members, found ways to maintain their identities even as everything around them collapsed. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, had a practice called the Mourning Wars, where they would adopt captives from other tribes to replace members lost to disease or warfare. It was a way to maintain population levels and cultural continuity. But during the waves of European diseases, even this couldn't keep up with the death toll. Some tribes interpreted the plagues as spiritual crises and turned to new religious movements. The Handsome Lake movement among the Seneca in the late 1700s, for instance, emerged partly in response to the social collapse caused by disease, alcohol, and land loss. It combined traditional Haudenosaunee beliefs with elements of Quaker Christianity and called for moral reform and cultural renewal. Others maintained their traditional practices with even more determination, seeing them as the only anchor in a world that was falling apart. What strikes me most is the resilience, not in a everything worked out fine way, because it didn't. Millions died, cultures were lost, languages disappeared, but the people who survived found ways to keep going, to maintain their identities, to pass on what they could to the next generation. That's not a happy ending. It's just the stubborn, quiet refusal to disappear entirely. Okay, we need to talk about diphtheria, because it was one of the primary childhood killers in colonial America, and it was absolutely brutal. Diphtheria is a bacterial infection that causes a thick membrane to form in the throat, blocking the airway. Children would literally suffocate to death over the course of days, and there was nothing anyone could do except watch. It was called the strangling angel because of how it killed, and because it primarily killed children. Whole families would lose multiple kids in a single outbreak. Parents would watch one child die, bury them, and then watch the next one start showing symptoms. The response was prayer, mostly, and quarantine, though that didn't always work because the bacteria could spread before symptoms appeared, and a kind of desperate hope that your child would be one of the lucky ones who survived. There are graveyards throughout New England filled with tiny headstones from the 1600s and 1700s, often with multiple children from the same family buried within days of each other. Here lies Sarah, aged 4 years. Here lies John, aged 6 years. Here lies Mary, aged 2 years. All died of throat distemper, which was what they called diphtheria. And people just had more children, because what else could you do? You couldn't stop having children because you were afraid they'd die. They might die anyway from diphtheria or smallpox or typhus or scarlet fever or any of 100 other things. So you had children, you loved them. You buried too many of them, and you kept going. There's a Puritan diary entry I remember reading where a father records the death of his 6th child from throat distemper. He writes, "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then the next entry is about planting corn. Just straight back to the mundane business of survival. That's not callousness. That's just how you cope when child death is so common that extended mourning would mean you never stop mourning. Scarlet fever deserves a mention here too, because it was another major childhood killer that people just accepted. Scarlet fever is caused by the same bacteria that causes strep throat, but in some people it produces a toxin that causes a characteristic red rash, high fever, and in severe cases, kidney or heart damage. It was most deadly to young children, and like diphtheria, it would sweep through communities in waves. The treatment was basically nothing. Keep the child comfortable, give them fluids, pray. Some people tried folk remedies, onion poultices, herbal teas, rubbing the child with vinegar. None of it made any real difference. What's interesting about scarlet fever is how it seemed to come and go in cycles. Some years, it would be relatively mild. Other years, it would be devastating. Modern researchers think this might have been due to different strains of the bacteria being more or less virulent, but people at the time had no way of knowing that. They just knew that some years, the scarlet fever season would barely touch their community, and other years it would kill every third child. The randomness of it is almost harder to cope with than the certainty of something like smallpox. At least with smallpox, you knew what you were dealing with. Scarlet fever was unpredictable. Your child might get a mild case and recover fully, or they might develop complications and die within days, or they might survive but be left with permanent heart damage that would kill them years later. So parents just lived with this constant low-level anxiety, knowing that every time their child got a fever or a sore throat, it might be nothing or it might be the beginning of the end. And they coped by accepting it, by seeing it as God's will or fate, or just the way things were. Because the alternative, living in constant terror of something you couldn't prevent or predict, would drive you insane. Let's talk about typhus for a bit, because it's one of the more overlooked killers, and it had a huge impact on both indigenous and colonial populations. Typhus is caused by bacteria spread by body lice, and it causes high fever, headache, rash, and delirium. In crowded, unsanitary conditions, which describes pretty much everywhere in colonial America, it spread like wildfire. It was particularly deadly during wars, when soldiers would be packed into camps with poor sanitation. The American Revolution saw massive typhus outbreaks among both Continental and British troops. More soldiers died of typhus than died in battle. But we don't build monuments to the guy who died shivering in a disease tent. The thing about typhus is that it didn't discriminate. Rich, poor, soldier, civilian. If you had lice and you were around other people with lice, you could catch it. And in an era when pretty much everyone had lice at some point, that meant everyone was vulnerable. Treatment was, as usual, basically useless. Doctors would bleed patients, give them mercury-based purges, or try various herbal remedies. The only thing that actually helped was basic hygiene, washing clothes, bathing, delousing. But even that wasn't foolproof. People faced typhus the same way they faced everything else, with resignation and whatever spiritual comfort they could find. If you were a soldier and you caught typhus, you'd be moved to a hospital tent where you'd either recover or die, usually within a week or two. Your fellow soldiers would pray for you, collect your belongings to send to your family, and then forget about you because they had their own survival to worry about. There's a description from a Continental Army surgeon during the Revolution where he talks about walking through a hospital tent and seeing rows of men in various stages of typhus, some delirious, some comatose, some already dead, but not yet removed. He describes it in this very matter-of-fact way, like he's describing a field of crops. No horror, no emotion, just documentation. That's the quiet acceptance we're talking about. When death is everywhere, you stop being shocked by it. You just document it and move on. Okay, we're going to continue, but I want to pause here for part 1. We've covered the initial waves of disease, from the arrival of Europeans through the colonial period, and we've established the theme of quiet endurance in the face of unstoppable plagues. In the next part, we'll move into the 18th and 19th centuries, talk about cholera epidemics, the continuing impact of smallpox, and how the young United States dealt with disease as it expanded westward. We'll also get into some of the truly bizarre medical treatments people tried and how religious and cultural responses to plague evolved over time. So take a breath, maybe get some water, and we'll continue this long, slow journey through America's history of dealing with death quietly. The Republic of Plagues, welcome back. I hope you're comfortable, because we're going to keep drifting through centuries of disease and the eerily calm ways people just dealt with it. We left off in the colonial period, with typhus ravaging military camps and children dying quietly of diphtheria in their beds. Now we're moving into the late 1700s and early 1800s, when the United States was establishing itself as a nation and simultaneously being absolutely pummeled by wave after wave of epidemic disease. The thing about this period is that people genuinely thought they were becoming more civilized, more enlightened, more advanced than their ancestors. The revolution had succeeded. Democracy was taking root. Science was advancing. And yet people were still dying of the same diseases that had killed their great-grandparents in roughly the same numbers, with roughly the same inability to do anything about it. There's something darkly funny about reading letters from the Founding Fathers, where they discuss philosophy and governance and the rights of man, and then mention, in passing, that half their children died before age 5. Thomas Jefferson lost 4 of his 6 children. John Adams lost 1. James Madison's wife Dolly had a son from her first marriage who died young, and Madison himself was chronically ill for most of his life. They just accepted it as part of the human condition. You could declare independence from Britain, but you couldn't declare independence from smallpox. Speaking of smallpox, let's talk about how it continued to shape American life well into the 1800s. Even though inoculation had become more accepted by the late 1700s, it was still dangerous, expensive, and not universally available. Poor people couldn't afford it. Rural people often didn't have access to it, and some religious communities still rejected it on theological grounds. So smallpox continued to kill, especially on the frontier as settlers pushed westward. Native American tribes that had managed to survive the initial waves of disease in the 1500s and 1600s got hit again in the 1700s and 1800s as contact increased. The Mandan people, who lived along the Missouri River in what's now North Dakota, were devastated by smallpox in 1837. They'd been a thriving agricultural society with a population estimated around 10,000. After the epidemic, fewer than 200 survived. The disease arrived on a steamboat carrying infected passengers. Within weeks, it had spread through the Mandan villages and to neighboring tribes. People died so fast that there weren't enough healthy people left to bury the dead. Bodies were left in lodges. Whole villages were abandoned. A fur trader named Francis Chardon kept a journal during the epidemic, and it's one of the most haunting documents from this period. He describes people throwing themselves into the river to escape the fever, parents killing their children and then themselves. Survivors wandering through empty villages, wailing for their dead. And then he goes back to recording the daily business of the trading post. How many pelts were brought in, what the weather was like, who owed him money. The horror is there in the journal, but so is the mundane continuation of commerce, because life doesn't stop even when the world is ending. The few Mandan survivors eventually merged with other tribes. Their language, their cultural practices, their specific identity as Mandan, all of it nearly disappeared. That's what epidemic disease could do. Not just kill individuals, but erase entire peoples. And the response from the US government? Basically nothing. Some army doctors tried to vaccinate frontier tribes. By this point, Edward Jenner had developed the actual smallpox vaccine using cowpox, which was much safer than inoculation. But the efforts were sporadic and underfunded. Most officials saw Native American deaths as either inevitable or convenient, since it opened up more land for white settlement. The quiet acceptance of indigenous death by white Americans is one of the darkest threads running through this entire history. It wasn't loud, genocidal violence in most cases. It was just letting people die, not providing medicine, not sharing vaccines, watching communities collapse, and then moving in to take their land. Manifest destiny, powered by microscopic organisms. Let's talk about cholera, because it's going to dominate the plague landscape for much of the 1800s. Cholera is caused by a bacteria found in contaminated water, and it's absolutely brutal. It causes severe diarrhea and vomiting, which leads to rapid dehydration. You can go from healthy to dead in less than a day. Your body loses so much fluid that your skin turns blue-gray. Your eyes sink into your skull, and you die looking like a mummified corpse. It's called the Blue Death for a reason. Cholera was endemic to India, but in the early 1800s, it started spreading globally. The first pandemic reached Europe in the 1820s, and by 1832, it had crossed the Atlantic to North America. New York City was hit hard. In the summer of 1832, cholera killed over 3,000 people in a city of about 200,000. That's roughly 1.5% of the population dead in a few months. The response was panic at first. People who could afford to fled the city. Businesses shut down. Churches held special prayer services. The poor, who couldn't leave, just stayed and hoped they'd be spared. But here's where it gets interesting. The panic didn't last. Within weeks, people adapted. The city hired extra workers to remove bodies and clean streets. Doctors, many of whom had no idea what was actually causing cholera, tried various treatments. Some helpful, like giving patients fluids, which actually does help with dehydration. Some useless, like bloodletting and mercury purges, which probably killed more people than they saved. And then people just kept living. Markets reopened. Ships kept arriving. Life continued because it had to. Cholera would return to American cities again and again throughout the 1800s. There were major outbreaks in 1849, 1854, 1866, and 1873. Each time, the same pattern: panic, flight, adaptation, quiet endurance. What's fascinating is how people's understanding of the disease evolved, even though they still got the cause wrong for decades. Most people thought cholera was spread by miasma, bad air from rotting organic matter. This led to some useful public health measures, like cleaning up garbage and improving sanitation, which did help reduce cholera, even though the reasoning was wrong. It's like accidentally getting the right answer on a math test by using the wrong formula. Some doctors noticed that cholera seemed to cluster around certain water sources, but they couldn't quite make the leap to understanding that contaminated water was the cause. It wasn't until John Snow's work in London in the 1850s that someone definitively proved the water connection. And even then, it took decades for the germ theory of disease to be widely accepted. In the meantime, people just coped. They drank questionable water because what else were they going to do? Die of thirst? They lived in crowded tenements because they couldn't afford anything else. They buried their dead and went back to work because rent was due and children needed to be fed. There's a description from the 1849 cholera epidemic in Cincinnati, where a journalist describes visiting the immigrant neighborhoods. Whole families crammed into single rooms, no running water, outdoor privies overflowing into the streets. And in the middle of all this, people cooking dinner, children playing, laundry hanging out to dry. Life stubbornly continuing in the face of death. The Irish immigrants who came to America during and after the potato famine in the 1840s faced cholera on top of everything else. They'd survived starvation in Ireland, survived the coffin ships across the Atlantic, where typhus and dysentery killed thousands, only to arrive in American cities and face cholera. And they just kept going. Got jobs, built churches, formed communities, buried their dead in potters' fields and tenement courtyards, and wherever else they could find space. The Catholic Church in cities like Boston and New York grew rapidly during this period, partly because Irish immigrants needed the spiritual comfort and community support the church provided in the face of constant loss. There's a strange beauty in that, I think. Not in the suffering, but in the human capacity to find meaning and connection, even when everything is terrible. People didn't curl up and die. They built institutions, maintained traditions, created new lives in a new place, all while navigating a landscape of disease and death that would be considered apocalyptic by modern standards. Yellow fever came roaring back in the 1800s, particularly in southern cities. New Orleans was hit repeatedly, major epidemics in 1817, 1819, 1822, 1829, 1832, 1833, 1839, 1841, and basically every few years after that through the 1850s. The city became synonymous with yellow fever. Summer in New Orleans meant fever season, as predictable as hurricanes. The wealthy would leave for the season, heading to summer homes in cooler, mosquito-free areas. The poor stayed behind and died in huge numbers. There's a grim economic calculation in all of this. Cities lost productivity every summer, but but not enough to justify the expense of actually figuring out what was causing the disease and stopping it. Memphis, Tennessee, had a catastrophic yellow fever epidemic in 1878 that nearly destroyed the city. Out of a population of about 47,000, around 20,000 fled. Of the 27,000 who stayed, over 17,000 got sick and 5,000 died. The city's government basically collapsed. There weren't enough healthy people to maintain basic services. Bodies piled up. The Howard Association, a volunteer organization dedicated to helping yellow fever victims, brought in nurses from other cities. Many of them died too, but they kept coming because someone had to. A group of Catholic nuns, the Sisters of St. Mary, stayed in Memphis throughout the epidemic and cared for the sick. Several of them died. They're buried in a special plot in the city cemetery, martyrs to a disease no one understood. And here's the thing that gets me. They knew they'd probably die. Yellow fever's mortality rate was well known, but they stayed anyway because their faith told them to serve the sick and dying, and so they did. That's not quiet acceptance. That's active choice in the face of almost certain death. It's the opposite of self-preservation, and it's both beautiful and heartbreaking. The survivors of the Memphis epidemic faced a city that was essentially bankrupt and depopulated. The state of Tennessee revoked Memphis's city charter. It became a taxing district for a while, basically a ward of the state. And then, slowly, people came back, rebuilt, started over. Because what else were you going to do? Memphis eventually implemented better sanitation, though they still didn't understand that mosquitoes were the problem. It wasn't until the early 1900s that yellow fever was finally brought under control through mosquito eradication programs. But by then, the disease had killed hundreds of thousands of people across the Americas. Let's drift over to measles for a bit, because it killed children steadily and quietly throughout this entire period. Measles is a viral infection that causes fever, cough, rash, and in severe cases, pneumonia, encephalitis, and death. It's incredibly contagious, one of the most contagious diseases known to humanity. Before vaccination, pretty much every child got measles at some point. Most survived, but enough didn't that measles was a major killer of children under 5. And for indigenous populations that hadn't been exposed to it, measles could be as devastating as smallpox. There are records from the Pacific Northwest in the 1840s and 1850s of measles epidemics, tearing through tribes that had had relatively limited contact with Europeans. The disease would arrive via trading posts or missionary stations, and within weeks, whole villages would be sick. The response was the same mix of traditional healing, quarantine attempts, and quiet endurance we've seen with other diseases. And the same massive population loss. For white American children, measles was just one of those things you expected your kids to get. You'd nurse them through it, hope they didn't develop complications, and breathe a sigh of relief when they recovered. And if they didn't recover, well, you buried another child and tried not to let it break you. There's a pattern in family Bibles from this era where parents would record births and deaths. You'll see entries like John, born 1843, died 1848, measles. Sarah, born 1845, died 1847, scarlet fever. Mary, born 1847, died 1849, putrid sore throat. Just dates and diseases recorded in careful handwriting. No elaborate eulogies. No extended mourning narratives. Just the facts, because what else could you say that hadn't already been said 100 times before? The emotional labor of parenting in this era is almost incomprehensible to modern people. You had to love your children enough to care for them properly, but not so much that losing them would destroy you, because you probably would lose some of them. It's a horrible balance, and people managed it somehow. They loved their children fiercely and also held something back, some protective distance, because complete emotional investment in beings that fragile was a recipe for madness. You can see it in letters from the period. Parents would write about their children with affection and pride, but there's often this underlying caution, this awareness that any child might not make it to adulthood. It's not coldness, it's self-protection. Whooping cough, or pertussis, deserves a mention here because it was another major childhood killer that people just accepted as inevitable. Whooping cough causes severe coughing fits that can last for weeks or months. In babies and young children, it can cause breathing to stop entirely. They'd cough so hard they'd vomit, or turn blue from lack of oxygen, or have seizures. The disease got its name from the whoop sound children make when they try to breathe in after a coughing fit. It's a horrible sound, apparently desperate and panicked. And there was nothing anyone could do except hold the child during coughing fits, try to keep them hydrated, and hope they survived. Some did. Many didn't. Whooping cough would sweep through communities in cycles, usually every few years. Parents would hear that whooping cough was in the area and feel that dread settling in, knowing that if their children caught it, the next few weeks would be a nightmare of sleepless nights, watching their child struggle to breathe, wondering if this coughing fit would be the one that killed them. The acceptance of this as normal is stunning. People would write letters saying things like, "The whooping cough is going through the neighborhood. We've lost 2 of the Henderson children already. I pray ours will be spared." And then the next paragraph would be about the weather or the crops or some bit of local gossip. It's not that they didn't care. It's that they cared within a framework of acceptance that disease and death were part of the natural order, and all you could do was pray and endure. Religious faith played a huge role in this acceptance, obviously. If you believed that God had a plan, that children who died went to heaven, that suffering had spiritual meaning, all of that made it easier to cope. Not easy, but easier. Alternative was to believe that your child's death was random, meaningless, and preventable, if only humans weren't so ignorant. That's a much harder pill to swallow, especially when you're the one who's ignorant and can't save your own child. So people chose faith, chose acceptance, chose to believe that it meant something. Let's talk about the Civil War for a bit, because it was a disease factory, unlike anything America had seen before. About 620,000 soldiers died during the Civil War. Of those, roughly 2/3 died of disease rather than combat. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, measles, smallpox, all of them ripped through military camps on both sides. The conditions were perfect for epidemic disease. Thousands of men crowded together, often from rural areas where they hadn't been exposed to childhood diseases like measles. Poor sanitation, latrines dug too close to water sources, food preparation areas contaminated with fecal matter, no understanding of germ theory, so no proper hygiene. Soldiers would drink from streams that other soldiers had been using as latrines. They'd sleep in tents filled with sick men. They'd eat food prepared by cooks who didn't wash their hands. And then they'd get sick and die, often without ever seeing combat. The medical corps did their best, but their best was still rooted in outdated ideas about disease. Doctors would perform surgery without washing their hands or sterilizing instruments. They'd reuse bandages. They'd house soldiers with different diseases in the same hospital wards, which just spread everything around faster. And soldiers accepted it with a kind of fatalistic resignation. You joined the army knowing you'd probably die. Maybe in battle, maybe of disease. Either way, it was part of the deal. Letters home from soldiers talk about disease in the same matter-of-fact way they talk about marching or drilling. Half the company is sick with the typhoid. Jim died yesterday. I'm feeling poorly myself, but hope to recover. Just reporting facts, no dramatics. The nurses and doctors who worked in Civil War hospitals faced this same quiet horror day after day. Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, worked as a battlefield nurse and described walking through hospital tents filled with dying men. Some from wounds, many from disease. The smell of gangrene and dysentery and unwashed bodies. The sounds of men crying for their mothers or praying or just moaning in pain. And she just kept working. Changed bandages, gave water, held hands, wrote final letters home. Because someone had to, and she'd chosen to be that someone. There's a special kind of endurance required for that work. Not the endurance of physical hardship, though that was part of it, but the emotional endurance of witnessing suffering and death on that scale and not letting it destroy you. Walt Whitman worked as a volunteer nurse in Washington, D.C. hospitals during the war and wrote about it extensively. He'd visit wounded soldiers, bring them small gifts, write letters for them, just sit with them. And he describes it in this beautiful, mournful way, the young men dying far from home, the waste of it all, but also the small moments of connection and tenderness in the midst of horror. There's a poem he wrote called The Wound Dresser that captures this perfectly. It's not about heroism or glory. It's about the quiet, repetitive work of caring for the sick and dying, dressing wounds, giving medicine, offering comfort, over and over until the war ends or you collapse from exhaustion. That's the kind of acceptance we're talking about. Not passive resignation, but active engagement with suffering, because the alternative is abandoning people who need help. After the Civil War, the country tried to rebuild, and diseases just kept killing people at a steady clip. Tuberculosis continued to be the leading cause of death. Diphtheria still strangled children. Scarlet fever, typhoid, cholera, when it flared up, all of it just background noise in American life. But something was starting to change. Germ theory was gaining acceptance among scientists and doctors. Louis Pasteur's work in France, Robert Koch's work in Germany, they were proving that specific microorganisms caused specific diseases. This was revolutionary. For thousands of years, people had theories about disease, miasma, humoral imbalance, divine punishment, but no real understanding of what actually caused it. Now, suddenly, there was an explanation. Tiny organisms, too small to see without a microscope, invading your body and making you sick. It took a while for this knowledge to filter down to practical applications, but when it did, it changed everything. Doctors started washing their hands. Surgeons started sterilizing instruments. Public health officials started focusing on sanitation and clean water. The results were dramatic. Cities that implemented proper sewage systems and clean water supplies saw disease rates plummet. Hospitals that adopted antiseptic practices saw post-surgical mortality rates drop from 50% to under 10% in some cases. But all of this happened slowly over decades. And in the meantime, people kept dying. Immigrant communities in American cities faced some of the worst conditions. Tenements in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, these were breeding grounds for disease. Whole families in 1 or 2 rooms, no ventilation, shared outdoor toilets, water from communal pumps that were often contaminated. Tuberculosis thrived in these conditions. So did typhoid, dysentery, and all the childhood diseases. Infant mortality rates in some tenement districts were over 30%. 3 out of every 10 babies died before their first birthday, and people just lived with it. Immigrant mothers would have baby after baby, knowing that several wouldn't survive. They'd mourn, they'd pray, they'd name the next baby after the one who died. It was a cycle of birth, death, and more birth. There's a Yiddish lullaby from this period that's absolutely heartbreaking. It's about a mother singing to her baby, telling the baby to sleep and grow strong, because so many other babies have died. The tenderness mixed with the awareness of death, it captures the immigrant experience perfectly. These communities developed strong mutual aid networks. Benevolent societies, religious organizations, labor unions, all of them provided some level of support for families dealing with illness and death. If someone got sick and couldn't work, the community would help with rent and food. If someone died, the community would help with burial costs. It wasn't charity in the condescending sense. It was survival. Everyone knew they might be the next one to get sick, to need help. So you helped others knowing you might need the same help later. There's a beautiful reciprocity to it, even in the midst of such harsh conditions. Let's talk about diphtheria antitoxin, because it's one of the first real victories against epidemic disease, and it shows how medical progress actually happened. In the 1890s, researchers developed an antitoxin for diphtheria. It was made from the blood serum of horses that had been immunized against diphtheria toxin. If you gave this antitoxin to a child who had diphtheria, it could actually save their life. This was huge. For the first time in human history, there was a treatment that that could stop a deadly disease in its tracks. But the implementation was messy and slow. The antitoxin was expensive. It had to be refrigerated, which meant it couldn't be easily distributed to rural areas. Some doctors didn't trust it. Some parents refused it on religious grounds. And even when it was available and people accepted it, it didn't always work. If you waited too long to administer it, after the membrane had already formed in the child's throat, it might not help. And some children had allergic reactions to the horse serum. But gradually, over the course of the 1890s and early 1900s, diphtheria mortality rates started to drop. Not disappear, the disease was still around, but fewer children were dying. And parents who'd grown up expecting to lose children to throat distemper suddenly had hope that their children might survive. That's a profound psychological shift. There's an account from a New York City tenement doctor in the early 1900s who describes going to treat a child with diphtheria. The parents were poor Jewish immigrants, and they were terrified because they'd already lost 2 children to the disease back in Russia. The doctor administered the antitoxin, and over the next few days, the child improved. The membrane dissolved. The breathing became easier. The fever broke. The child survived. And the parents wept with relief and gratitude, but also with something like bewilderment. Because in their entire experience, in everything they'd been taught by their parents and grandparents, children who got throat distemper died. That was just how it worked. But now, suddenly, it didn't have to work that way. That's what medical progress looks like on the ground. Not dramatic miracle cures, but gradual shifts where slightly more children survive, and parents start to hope instead of just accept. We need to talk about influenza because there were several major flu pandemics in the 1800s that killed hundreds of thousands of people, but they've been largely forgotten. The 1889-1890 flu pandemic, sometimes called the Russian flu, killed about 1 million people worldwide. In the United States, it caused major outbreaks in cities and contributed to already high winter mortality rates. People called it the grip because of how it seemed to grip your lungs and not let go. High fever, body aches, severe cough, exhaustion. Most people recovered after a week or 2, but enough didn't that it was a major public health event. And people just dealt with it. Stayed in bed, drank fluids, took patent medicines that didn't do anything, hoped they'd recover. Businesses stayed open. Schools stayed open. Life continued because there was no concept of flattening the curve or social distancing. The idea that you could slow disease spread by changing behavior existed in a limited way, quarantining sick people, avoiding crowds during epidemics, but it wasn't systematically applied, mostly because people couldn't afford to. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. So you worked, even if you were sick, and you spread the disease to everyone around you. The wealthy could afford to stay home when sick. The poor couldn't. So disease spread more readily among the poor, who then were blamed for being vectors of disease. It's a vicious cycle that continued well into the 20th century. There's a letter from a factory worker in Massachusetts during the 1889 flu pandemic, where he describes being so sick he could barely stand. But going to work anyway because he'd be fired if he missed more than a day. He infected half the workers in his section of the factory. But what was he supposed to do? Let his family starve. These are the impossible choices that poverty forces on people, and disease exploits those vulnerabilities ruthlessly. I want to talk about the psychological and cultural impact of living with this level of death, because it shaped American identity in ways we don't always recognize. There's a reason Victorian death culture was so elaborate. The mourning clothes, the elaborate funerals, the post-mortem photography, the hair jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, all of it was a way of processing and ritualizing constant loss. If you're going to lose multiple family members to disease, you need rituals to help you cope. You need ways to honor the dead, to maintain connection to them, to mark their passing as significant even though death is everywhere. The cult of domesticity that emerged in the 19th century, the idea that the home was a sacred space, and women were the moral guardians of the family, was partly a response to high child mortality. If children were likely to die young, motherhood became even more precious, more spiritually significant. Women were expected to create a perfect Christian home environment that would prepare children's souls for heaven, since their bodies might not last long on earth. This put enormous pressure on women, of course. If your child died, had you failed as a mother? Had you not prayed hard enough, not created a pious enough home? The spiritual burden was crushing. There's a whole genre of 19th century literature about the angel child who dies young and goes to heaven. It was meant to be comforting. Your child is now an angel, waiting for you in paradise. But it also reinforced the idea that children's deaths were inevitable, and even somehow beautiful or spiritually meaningful, which is a very convenient belief if you're a society that can't actually prevent children from dying. The acceptance of death as natural and even spiritually beneficial allowed people to cope, but it also reduced the urgency around preventing death. If children dying young meant they went straight to heaven without the risk of sinning as adults, was it really so bad? Some religious thinkers genuinely argued this, that high infant mortality was God's mercy, ensuring more souls reached heaven, which is a horrifying way to frame the preventable deaths of millions of children, but it helped people sleep at night, so they embraced it. Let's drift into the late 1800s and talk about how urbanization changed disease patterns. As American cities grew rapidly during the Industrial Revolution, they became incredibly dense and incredibly dirty. Tenements, factories, stockyards, all crammed together. Waste disposal was primitive, often just throwing garbage in the street or dumping it in rivers. Water came from wells that were often contaminated by nearby outhouses. This created perfect conditions for waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid, and airborne diseases like tuberculosis. But it also created a critical mass of people who cared about public health, because the wealthy couldn't escape disease anymore. When cholera only killed poor immigrants, the rich didn't care. But when cholera started affecting middle-class neighborhoods, because of shared water supplies. Suddenly, there was political will for reform. The sanitation reform movement in American cities in the 1880s and 1890s was driven partly by genuine humanitarian concern, but mostly by self-interest. Rich people didn't want to get sick, so they supported building sewage systems and water treatment plants. And it worked. Cities that implemented these reforms saw dramatic drops in disease rates. New York City's typhoid mortality rate dropped by over 70% between 1890 and 1920, mostly due to improved water quality. But again, this was slow and uneven. Rich neighborhoods got clean water first. Poor neighborhoods waited years or even decades, and rural areas were mostly left to fend for themselves. So you had this strange situation where some Americans were experiencing genuine medical progress and declining disease rates, while others were still living in conditions that hadn't changed much since the colonial period. The quiet acceptance of this disparity is part of the story too. People in tenements knew that rich people had better water, better housing, better medical care. But what were they going to do about it? Revolution. Most people were too busy surviving to organize politically. There were labor movements and social reform movements that addressed these issues, but change was incremental. Meanwhile, people kept getting sick and dying at different rates depending on their zip code. Okay, we're going to pause here for part 2. We've covered the 19th century pretty thoroughly: cholera, yellow fever, the Civil War disease crisis, early medical advances, and the psychological and cultural adaptations to constant death. In part 3, we'll move into the early 20th century and talk about the 1918 flu pandemic, the final victory over smallpox, the continuing battle against tuberculosis and polio. We'll also get into how public health became more organized and how Americans' relationship with epidemic disease started to shift from acceptance to the expectation that diseases could and should be conquered. Take a break, stretch, maybe check that you're still breathing. We're going to keep going because there are a lot more plagues to cover and a lot more quiet deaths to document. The dying time, all right, welcome back. We're moving into the 20th century now, and you'd think things would get better, right? Modern medicine, scientific breakthroughs, actual understanding of what causes disease. And they did get better eventually. But first, they got catastrophically worse in ways that nobody saw coming. The early 1900s were this weird transitional period where people knew enough about disease to understand what was killing them, but not enough to actually stop it in most cases. Doctors could identify tuberculosis bacteria under a microscope, but they still couldn't cure it. They understood that mosquitoes spread yellow fever, but controlling mosquito populations was harder than it sounds. They knew contaminated water caused cholera, but building clean water infrastructure for entire cities took decades and enormous amounts of money. So people were caught in this frustrating middle ground where death was no longer quite so mysterious, but it was still just as inevitable. Let's start with tuberculosis, because it's going to dominate the first half of the century. By 1900, TB was still the leading cause of death in the United States, killing about 200 out of every 100,000 people annually. That's roughly 150,000 deaths per year in a country of about 76 million people. And those are just the reported deaths. Actual numbers were probably higher. The treatment for tuberculosis in the early 1900s was basically go somewhere with fresh air and hope for the best. Sanitariums became big business. These were facilities, usually in mountains or other areas with clean air, where TB patients would go to rest, eat well, and breathe fresh air. The theory was that healthy living could help the body fight off the infection. And sometimes it worked. Some people's immune systems did manage to wall off the TB bacteria, and they'd recover, or at least go into remission. But most people didn't recover. They'd spend months or years at sanitariums, slowly wasting away, coughing blood, losing weight, until they died far from home. The sanitarium experience was this strange mix of hope and resignation. Patients would form communities, fall in love, get married, have children, all while knowing they were probably dying. There are photographs from sanitariums showing patients bundled up in blankets on outdoor porches in the middle of winter, because fresh air was considered essential even when it was freezing. They'd lie there for hours, breathing cold air, watching snow fall, waiting to either get better or die. The quiet acceptance of this routine is haunting. People would spend years in sanitariums, following strict regimens of rest and fresh air, with no guarantee it would work. And they just did it. Because what else were you going to do? There's a memoir by a woman who spent 3 years at a sanitarium in the Adirondacks in the 1920s. She describes the daily routine: breakfast in bed, morning rest, lunch in bed, afternoon rest, dinner in bed, evening rest. The same every day for years. She writes about making friends with other patients and then watching them die, one by one. About falling in love with a fellow patient who proposed to her and then died 2 weeks later. About the suffocating boredom mixed with constant low-level anxiety about whether she was getting better or worse. And through it all, this acceptance that this was just her life now. No fighting it, no raging against the unfairness, just endurance. The families of TB patients faced their own quiet suffering. Tuberculosis was expensive. Sanitarium care could cost hundreds of dollars a month, a fortune for working-class families. So families would scrape together money, take on extra work, go into debt, all to send a loved one to a sanitarium where they'd probably die anyway. And when the person did die, the family would still be in debt, still be struggling. But now without that family member's potential future earnings or help around the house. It's a brutal economic calculation that millions of families had to make. Some families couldn't afford sanitariums, so they'd just keep the TB patient at home and hope they didn't infect everyone else, which they usually did. TB spread readily in crowded homes, so you'd often see multiple family members get sick in succession. There are tenement records from New York in the early 1900s showing families where the father died of TB, then the mother, then the children one by one. The surviving orphans would be sent to orphanages or farmed out to relatives, carrying the trauma of watching their entire family die. And this was just normal, expected, sad, but not shocking. Let's talk about polio, because it's going to become one of the most feared diseases of the early to mid-20th century. Polio is caused by a virus that attacks the nervous system. In most people, it causes mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. But in some people, especially children, it causes paralysis. Legs, arms, sometimes the breathing muscles. Before the 20th century, polio was relatively rare in the United States. But as sanitation improved, paradoxically, polio outbreaks got worse. Here's why. When sanitation was terrible and everyone was exposed to all kinds of filth all the time, babies would get exposed to polio very young, while they still had some immunity from their mothers. They'd get a mild case and then be immune for life. But when sanitation improved, children weren't exposed until they were older, when the disease was more likely to cause paralysis. So middle-class and wealthy children who lived in cleaner environments were actually at higher risk than poor children. This was deeply disturbing to early 20th century Americans because it violated the assumption that cleanliness and wealth protected you from disease. Polio could strike anyone, anywhere, and it seemed random and cruel in a way that other diseases didn't. The 1916 polio epidemic in New York City killed about 6,000 people, mostly children, and left thousands more paralyzed. The city's response was a mix of public health measures and panic. They quarantined homes where polio cases were found, marking them with signs that said infantile paralysis. That's what they called polio at the time. They restricted children's activities, closed swimming pools and movie theaters, banned public gatherings. Parents were told to keep their children at home, and people complied, mostly out of sheer terror. There was something uniquely horrible about a disease that targeted children and left them crippled for life. Death was one thing, people were used to children dying, but paralysis was different. Your child survived, but was trapped in a body that didn't work anymore. The quiet desperation of parents during polio epidemics is palpable in the historical record. They'd keep their children indoors all summer, away from other kids, away from swimming holes and playgrounds. And then their child would get sick anyway, because nobody actually knew how polio spread. They thought it might be through flies, or contaminated food, or bad air. The actual route, fecal-oral transmission, wasn't understood until later. So parents were doing everything they could think of, and it didn't help, and their children got paralyzed anyway. The iron lung became a symbol of polio's cruelty. These were metal chambers that would mechanically breathe for people whose breathing muscles were paralyzed. Patients would lie inside them for weeks, months, sometimes years, with just their heads sticking out. There are photographs from polio wards in the 1940s and 50s showing rows of iron lungs, each one containing a child or young adult, all of them unable to breathe on their own. The staff would walk between the rows, checking on patients, adjusting settings, keeping people alive through sheer mechanical persistence. And the patients just endured it. What else could they do? There's an interview with a polio survivor from the 1950s who spent 2 years in an iron lung as a teenager. She describes the boredom, the fear, the physical discomfort of being unable to move. But she also talks about the camaraderie among patients, the kindness of nurses, the small joys of visits from family. She lived because of that machine, but she also describes it as a prison. And when she was finally able to leave it and use a wheelchair instead, she felt free, even though she'd never walk again. That's the kind of psychological adaptation humans are capable of. Finding gratitude for being in a wheelchair instead of an iron lung. Making peace with paralysis because the alternative was death. All right, we need to talk about the 1918 influenza pandemic because it's the biggest disease catastrophe in modern American history, and it deserves its own extended section. The 1918 flu killed an estimated 675,000 Americans and about 50 million people worldwide. In the span of about 18 months, roughly 1 in 3 people on Earth got infected. And the mortality rate, while not as high as something like smallpox, was still around 2-3% of those infected, which adds up fast when you're talking about billions of infections. What made the 1918 flu particularly terrifying was that it killed young, healthy adults in their 20s and 30s at much higher rates than regular flu. Most influenzas kill the very young and very old people with weak immune systems. But the 1918 flu seemed to cause an immune system overreaction in healthy people, where their own immune response would flood their lungs with fluid and they'd essentially drown. So you'd have a perfectly healthy 25-year-old go to work feeling fine, come home with a fever, and be dead 3 days later. It was fast, it was brutal, and it was everywhere. The pandemic hit in 3 waves. The first wave in spring 1918 was relatively mild. The second wave in fall 1918 was devastating. The third wave in winter 1919 was somewhere in between. And the timing couldn't have been worse, because the United States was in the middle of World War. The virus probably originated in military camps, where thousands of young men from all over the country were crowded together in barracks. Perfect conditions for a respiratory virus to spread. And then those men were shipped overseas to Europe, bringing the virus with them and spreading it globally. The government's response was complicated. On one hand, public health officials tried to implement measures to slow the spread, closing schools and churches, banning public gatherings, requiring masks in some cities. On the other hand, the government was desperate to maintain morale for the war effort, so they downplayed the severity and censored negative news coverage. This created a bizarre situation where people were dying by the thousands, but newspapers were printing cheerful articles about how the flu was no big deal and everyone should support the troops. The quiet acceptance during this pandemic had a different flavor than earlier epidemics. People were tired from the war. They'd already been sacrificing for years, sending sons and husbands overseas, dealing with rationing, working in factories. And now they had to deal with a plague on top of everything else. There was a kind of exhausted resignation. Fine, flu pandemic. What else could possibly go wrong? People wore masks, though not universally, and not always correctly. There are photographs from 1918 showing streetcar conductors refusing to let people board without masks. Other photos showing people wearing masks under their noses, or made of such thin material they wouldn't have done anything. Some cities took it seriously. San Francisco had a mask ordinance and enforced it strictly. Philadelphia held a huge parade to sell war bonds in September 1918, despite warnings from public health officials. And within days, the city's hospitals were overwhelmed. Philadelphia's experience was catastrophic. The morgues filled up. Bodies were stacked in warehouses. There weren't enough coffins, so people built crude wooden boxes or wrapped bodies in sheets. Mass graves were dug. The city essentially collapsed under the weight of death, and people just kept going. Doctors and nurses worked until they collapsed from exhaustion or caught the flu themselves. Volunteers stepped up to care for the sick when professional medical staff ran out. Families buried their dead and went back to work because bills still needed to be paid. There's a diary entry from a Philadelphia nurse in October 1918 where she describes her day. Started at 6 a.m., visited 20 flu patients in their homes, watched 3 of them die, stopped briefly for a sandwich, visited 15 more patients, got home at midnight, collapsed into bed still in her uniform. And then she got up the next day and did it again. The emotional toll was enormous. People couldn't properly mourn because there were too many dead and not enough time. Funerals were rushed or skipped entirely. Bodies were buried in mass graves without much ceremony. For people who'd grown up with elaborate Victorian mourning rituals, this was deeply distressing. You were supposed to honor the dead, to mark their passing with respect and solemnity. But how do you do that when dozens of people are dying every day and you're just trying to keep up with disposal? So people made peace with it. They let go of the rituals, did what had to be done, and saved the grieving for later. Except for many people, later never came. The pandemic ended, the war ended. Everyone was supposed to move on and be happy. The roaring 20s were right around the corner time to forget the trauma and party. A lot of people never processed what they'd been through. They just buried it, literally and figuratively, and tried to move forward. There's a particular cruelty to the 1918 flu that I want to highlight. It killed entire families. Because it spread so easily within households, you'd often see the whole family get sick at once. And if the parents died, which was likely, since the flu killed young adults, the children were orphaned. Thousands of children lost one or both parents in the space of a few days. There are records from orphanages in 1918-1919 showing massive increases in admissions. Children as young as infants being dropped off because both parents had died and there was no one to care for them. Extended family would take in orphans when they could, but many families were barely surviving themselves. So kids ended up in institutions or were sent to live with relatives they'd never met, or in some cases, just ended up on the streets. The long-term psychological impact on that generation is hard to measure, but it was real. These children grew up to be the adults of the Great Depression and World War II, carrying trauma from the flu pandemic that they probably never talked about because everyone was trying to forget. There's a documentary interview with a woman who was 7 years old during the 1918 flu. She describes her mother dying first, then her father 2 days later. She and her siblings were sent to live with an aunt who didn't really want them. She says, and this is heartbreaking, that she learned not to cry because crying annoyed her aunt. So she just stopped crying and became very quiet. That quiet acceptance, forced on a child who'd lost everything. It's emblematic of how people coped with the pandemic by shutting down emotionally and just enduring. After the 1918 flu, there was this collective amnesia about it. The pandemic killed more Americans than World War I, but it's barely mentioned in history books. Veterans get memorials and holidays. The flu victims got nothing really. Part of this was because there was no clear enemy to blame. You can't have a memorial to bad luck or microscopic viruses. There was no one to be angry at, no one to defeat. The virus just appeared, killed millions, and then mutated into something less deadly and disappeared. So people just moved on. And maybe that was healthy, in a way. Maybe dwelling on something you can't change or understand or prevent is worse than just accepting it and moving forward. Or maybe it was unhealthy, and a whole generation carried unprocessed trauma that expressed itself in other ways. Probably both. Let's talk about the Roaring Twenties and how Americans tried to forget about death for a while. After World War I and the flu pandemic, there was this desperate desire to have fun, to live, to forget. People danced, drank despite prohibition, spent money they didn't have, embraced modern culture. But disease didn't go away just because people wanted to party. Tuberculosis was still killing over 100,000 Americans per year in the 1920s. Pneumonia, influenza, regular flu, not pandemic flu, and diarrheal diseases were still major killers. Child mortality was still high, though it was starting to drop thanks to better sanitation and the beginning of childhood vaccination programs. The difference was that people's relationship with death was changing. Instead of quiet acceptance, there was starting to be anger. Why should children die of diphtheria when there's an antitoxin? Why should people die of tuberculosis when we know what causes it? The expectation that disease could and should be conquered was taking root, even though the tools to actually do that weren't quite there yet. This created a new kind of suffering, hope mixed with disappointment. When you accept death as inevitable, you can make peace with it. When you believe death should be preventable, every death feels like a failure. Someone should have done something. Medicine should have advanced faster. The government should have provided better public health services. Parents who lost children in the 1920s had a harder time accepting it than parents in the 1820s, paradoxically, because they'd been told that modern medicine was conquering disease. So, why did their child still die? There's a letter from a mother in 1927 whose son died of scarlet fever. She writes about how she'd read in magazines that scarlet fever was no longer the terror it used to be, that treatments were improving. So when her son got sick, she took him to the doctor, followed all the instructions, did everything right, and he died anyway. And she's angry in a way that earlier grieving parents weren't. She feels betrayed by the promise of modern medicine. It was supposed to save her son, and it didn't. That's a new kind of grief, specific to the modern era. The grief of dashed expectations. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and suddenly healthcare became even more out of reach for millions of Americans. Hospitals, doctors, medicines, all of it cost money that people didn't have. So people just didn't seek medical care unless they were desperate. They'd try home remedies, folk cures, patent medicines. They'd wait until they were so sick they couldn't function, and then maybe, if they were lucky, they'd see a doctor. Preventive care was a luxury. Didn't go to the doctor for checkups. You went when you were dying, and sometimes not even then. This meant that treatable conditions became fatal because people couldn't afford treatment. Someone with appendicitis would die because they couldn't afford the surgery. Someone with an infection would die because they couldn't afford antibiotics. Wait, no, antibiotics weren't available yet. That's coming. The quiet suffering of the Depression era is its own special horror. People were hungry, desperate, ashamed. And on top of all that, they were sick. There are oral history interviews with people who lived through the Depression, and they talk about illness in this very matter-of-fact way. Pa got the pneumonia and couldn't work for 3 months. We nearly lost the farm. My baby sister died of the whooping cough. Ma couldn't afford the doctor. Just stating facts, no elaboration. Because what was there to say? Everyone was suffering. Your suffering wasn't special. The government did set up some public health programs, clinics, vaccination programs, food assistance. But they were underfunded and couldn't begin to meet the need. So people relied on each other. Neighbors sharing what little they had. Churches providing charity. Extended families taking in relatives. And they endured, because that's what humans do. We endure. Let's talk about the discovery of antibiotics, because it's one of the great turning points in medical history. Penicillin was discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but it wasn't mass-produced until the 1940s during World War II. When it became available, it was revolutionary. Infections that had been death sentences, pneumonia, infected wounds, scarlet fever, syphilis, were suddenly treatable. You'd take some pills or get an injection, and you'd get better. It seemed like magic. The first widespread civilian use of penicillin in the United States was in the mid-1940s, and the impact was immediate and dramatic. Mortality rates from bacterial infections plummeted. Mothers who'd expected to lose children to infections suddenly didn't. Soldiers with infected wounds survived. People with pneumonia recovered in days instead of dying in weeks. There's a newspaper article from 1945 about a woman whose child had scarlet fever. She describes taking the child to the hospital, getting penicillin, and watching the child recover completely within a few days. She calls it a miracle, And it was, in a way. For the first time in human history, we had a tool that could reliably cure bacterial infections. But here's the thing. Penicillin arrived after most of the major bacterial plague epidemics had already declined. Improved sanitation, vaccination, better nutrition. These had already brought down death rates from diseases like typhoid, cholera, and diphtheria. Penicillin was the final blow against bacterial diseases, not the first one. But it felt revolutionary because it was so immediate and so effective at the individual level. The quiet acceptance of death from infection, which humans had lived with for millennia, suddenly ended. Within a generation, people went from expecting infections to kill to expecting them to be minor inconveniences. That's an enormous psychological shift. Parents in the 1950s had fundamentally different expectations than parents in the 1850s. They expected their children to survive childhood. They expected antibiotics to cure infections. They expected medicine to work. And mostly, it did. Child mortality rates dropped to historic lows. Life expectancy increased dramatically. Disease stopped being an ever-present specter and became something that happened to other people, or in poor countries, or in the past. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still need to talk about polio in the 1940s and 50s, because it was the last great epidemic disease panic in American history. Polio outbreaks continued throughout the 1940s and early 50s, and they were terrifying precisely because everything else was getting better. Antibiotics were curing infections. Vaccines were preventing diphtheria and whooping cough. But polio, no cure, no prevention, just the same fear and paralysis. The 1952 polio epidemic was the worst in American history. Over 57,000 cases, over 3,000 deaths, and thousands more left paralyzed. Parents kept their kids inside during the summer. Public swimming pools were closed. Summer camps were canceled. There was this pervasive anxiety that your child might be the next one to end up in an iron lung. The March of Dimes, founded by FDR, who'd had polio himself, though he hid the extent of his paralysis, raised millions of dollars for polio research. Everyone donated. Kids would collect dimes door to door. Celebrities did fundraisers. It was a national obsession. And in 1955, Jonas Salk's polio vaccine was declared safe and effective. The response was jubilation. Church bells rang. Parents wept with relief. Schools held vaccine clinics, and kids lined up to get their shots. Within a few years, polio cases dropped by over 90%. The iron lung wards emptied out. The summer anxiety ended. That was it. The last major epidemic disease in the United States, defeated by science. For people who'd grown up with the quiet acceptance of epidemic death, this was almost incomprehensible. Diseases that had killed for centuries were just gone, conquered by vaccines and antibiotics and public health. It felt like humanity had won. Okay, we're going to pause here for part 3. We've covered the early to mid-20th century TB sanitariums, the 1918 flu, the Depression, antibiotics, and the conquest of polio. In part 4, We'll talk about how the victory over epidemic disease changed American culture, the rise and fall of public health confidence, the diseases that persisted, and bring the story up to more recent times. We'll also talk about what we lost when we lost the quiet acceptance of death, and what we gained. Stretch, hydrate, check that you're still comfortable. We're in the home stretch now, but there's still a lot to cover. The age of forgetting, welcome back. We're moving into the second half of the 20th century now, and this is where the story gets weird in a different way. For most of human history, people lived with the constant presence of epidemic disease and death. And then, in the span of about 30 years, roughly 1940 to 1970, that all changed. Antibiotics, vaccines, improved sanitation, better nutrition. The major killers that had stalked humanity for thousands of years just stopped, and Americans forgot what it was like to live with plague. This forgetting happened fast. A generation grew up in the 1950s and 60s who never experienced a major epidemic, who got their vaccines as children and never thought about diphtheria or polio again, who took antibiotics when they got strep throat and recovered in days. Death from infectious disease became rare enough that when it happened, it was shocking. Tragic, not just sad, but wrong, a failure of the medical system. The quiet acceptance that had sustained people through centuries of plague disappeared, replaced by the expectation that medicine should save everyone. And when it didn't, people were angry. This is actually a good thing, mostly. That anger drove more medical research, better public health systems, higher standards of care. The expectation that children should survive childhood is a beautiful thing, even if it creates new kinds of anxiety. But something was lost too. The ability to sit with death, to accept it as part of life, to find meaning in suffering. These were survival skills that humanity had developed over millennia. And within a generation, we didn't need them anymore. Or at least, we thought we didn't need them anymore. Let's start with tuberculosis, because its slow decline is actually a really interesting story. TB death rates had been dropping since the late 1800s, even before there was any effective treatment. Better nutrition, less crowded housing, sanatorium care, all of this helped people's immune systems fight off the infection. But the real victory came with antibiotics. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, was the first effective anti-TB drug. It didn't cure everyone, but it cured enough people that TB stopped being the inevitable death sentence it had been for centuries. By the 1950s, there were multiple anti-TB antibiotics and treatment regimens that could actually cure the disease. The sanitariums started closing. Patients went home. TB wards in hospitals emptied out. And within a generation, TB became something Americans associated with the past. Dickens' novels, Victorian poetry, not a real present danger, except it never completely went away. TB persisted in poor communities, among homeless populations, in prisons. But middle-class America stopped thinking about it, stopped worrying about it. This pattern would repeat with other diseases. Once they stopped affecting the mainstream, they became invisible. There's an oral history interview with a woman who worked at a TB sanitarium in upstate New York in the 1940s and 50s. She describes watching the patient population slowly decline as antibiotics became available. Rooms that had held dozens of patients were down to just a few. Wings of the building were closed off. She says the strangest thing was how quickly people forgot. Former patients who'd spent years at the sanitarium would get cured, go home, and apparently just never mention it again. It was like they wanted to erase that chapter of their lives completely. And maybe that was healthy. Maybe you need to forget the trauma to move forward. But it also meant that within a generation, the lived experience of TB, the years in sanitariums, the quiet acceptance of wasting away became something no one talked about, just erased from cultural memory. Let's talk about the rise of chronic disease, because this is when the disease landscape in America fundamentally shifted. With infectious diseases under control, people started living long enough to die of other things. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke. These became the new major killers, and they required a totally different kind of acceptance. Infectious diseases, for all their horror, were often relatively quick. You got sick, you either recovered or died, usually within weeks or months. Chronic diseases could last for years or decades. You'd be diagnosed with heart disease at 50 and live with it for 30 years, slowly declining, managing symptoms, adjusting medications. It's a different kind of dying. Slower, more medicalized, more uncertain. And Americans didn't quite know how to cope with it, because all the old frameworks for accepting death were built around acute illness. You got sick suddenly. You made your peace with God. You died. Clean and relatively quick. But how do you make peace with death when it's happening in slow motion over decades? When you're not sick enough to be dying, but not healthy enough to really live? The quiet acceptance that worked for plague didn't quite fit chronic disease. You couldn't just resign yourself to death when death might not come for 20 years. You had to live in this liminal space of being sick, but functional, managing disease, but not cured. This created new kinds of suffering that earlier generations hadn't dealt with. The frustration of chronic pain, the indignity of dependence, the slow erosion of ability and autonomy. And medicine didn't really have good answers for how to cope with this. Doctors were trained to cure disease, not to help people live with incurable conditions. So they just kept treating symptoms, prescribing medications, doing procedures, because doing something felt better than accepting there was nothing to do. Patients went along with this because the alternative, just accepting decline and death, felt like giving up. And Americans don't give up. We fight. We try experimental treatments. We get second opinions. We rage against the dying of the light, which is noble in a way, but also exhausting. There's a memoir by a man whose father had heart disease for 30 years before finally dying in the 1980s. He describes the constant cycle of hope and disappointment. A new medication would work for a while, then stop working. A procedure would help, then complications would arise. His father would get better, then worse, then a little better, then worse again. He says it was harder than if his father had just died quickly, because they could never properly grieve. There was always this tension between hope and resignation, and they were trapped in it for decades. That's the unique suffering of the chronic disease era. Not the acute terror of plague, but the grinding, exhausting uncertainty of slow decline. We need to talk about cancer because it became the most feared disease in the second half of the 20th century. Cancer had always existed, obviously, but it became more common as people lived longer and as environmental carcinogens increased. And unlike infectious diseases, cancer couldn't be prevented with a vaccine or cured with antibiotics. The early treatments, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, were brutal and often didn't work. People would endure horrific side effects, lose their hair, vomit constantly, waste away, all for maybe a few extra months of life. The suffering was immense, but it was different from plague suffering. With plague, you were passive. The disease happened to you. With cancer treatment, you were active. You chose to suffer through treatment in hopes of recovery. That element of choice added a new psychological dimension. If you chose treatment and it didn't work, did you make the wrong choice? If you chose not to treat and died, did you give up too easily? The quiet acceptance of earlier eras didn't allow for this kind of second guessing. You got sick, you accepted it, you died. No choice, no guilt. But modern medicine gave patients choices, which meant they could make wrong choices, which meant there was a whole new layer of suffering around decision-making and regret. Families would fight over what treatment to pursue. Should mom do the experimental chemotherapy, or should she focus on quality of life? Should dad have the surgery even though it might kill him? Should we try the alternative treatments, the special diets, the supplements? The burden of these decisions was crushing, and there was no framework for making them because this level of medical choice was historically unprecedented. People tried to apply the old acceptance framework, God's will. Whatever happens is meant to be. But it didn't quite fit when you were the one deciding whether to do chemo or not. So families muddled through, making impossible decisions with incomplete information, and then living with the consequences. There's a letter from a woman in the 1970s whose husband had lung cancer. She describes the agonizing decision about whether to do aggressive treatment or focus on comfort care. They chose aggressive treatment because the doctor said there was a chance, and her husband suffered through months of chemotherapy before dying anyway. She writes that she'll never know if they made the right choice. Maybe he would have died sooner without treatment, or maybe he would have had a better quality of life in his final months if they'd skipped the chemo. She'll never know, and that uncertainty haunts her. That's a specifically modern form of grief. The grief of choices made under impossible conditions, with life or death stakes, and no clear right answer. Let's talk about AIDS, because it was a massive rupture in the narrative that America had conquered epidemic disease. The first AIDS cases were identified in 1981, and within a few years, it was clear this was a major epidemic. A new virus, transmissible through blood and sexual contact, that destroyed the immune system and eventually killed almost everyone who got infected. And there was was no cure, no vaccine, no effective treatment, at least not at first. For Americans who'd grown up believing that epidemic disease was a thing of the past, this was profoundly disturbing. Infectious diseases weren't supposed to emerge anymore. Medicine was supposed to have this under control. But here was a plague that looked like something out of the Middle Ages. People wasting away, developing horrible opportunistic infections, dying young. The response was complicated by the fact that AIDS initially affected primarily gay men and injection drug users, marginalized communities that mainstream America was happy to ignore or blame. There was this ugly narrative that AIDS was punishment for immoral behavior, that people got what they deserved, which is exactly the kind of thinking that medieval people had about plague, just dressed up in modern language. So instead of the collective mobilization that had defeated polio, there was indifference and stigma. The government response was slow and inadequate. Research funding was minimal. Patients were abandoned by families, fired from jobs, evicted from housing, and the gay community had to organize its own response. Care networks, buddy systems to help people who were dying, political activism to demand research and treatment. The quiet acceptance of death looked different in the AIDS crisis. It wasn't resignation to God's will or natural order. It was a kind of defiant grief. People were dying, and it was unjust, and it was preventable if society would just care enough to do something about it. There's a power in that kind of anger that the old acceptance didn't have. The ACT UP protests, the AIDS memorial quilt, the insistence that these deaths mattered, all of it forced society to pay attention in a way that quiet endurance never would have. But the cost was enormous. An entire generation of gay men wiped out. Artists, activists, friends, lovers gone. The survivors carry a specific kind of trauma. They watched dozens or hundreds of people die, one after another, for years. They cared for dying friends, went to funeral after funeral, lived with the constant threat that they might be next. There's an oral history project of AIDS survivors from the 1980s and early 90s, and the interviews are heartbreaking. People describe watching their entire social circle disappear, keeping lists of the dead because there were too many to remember otherwise. One man describes going to 3 or 4 funerals a month at the peak of the epidemic. He says he became numb to it, stopped really grieving, just went through the motions. And then, years later, after effective treatments became available and he survived, the grief hit him all at once. Decades of suppressed mourning flooding back. That's another form of the quiet acceptance, not accepting at the time, but shutting down emotionally to survive, and then dealing with the consequences later. The discovery of effective antiretroviral therapy in the mid-1990s changed AIDS from a death sentence to a manageable chronic disease. People who'd been planning their funerals suddenly had a future again. The psychological whiplash of that transition is hard to imagine. You've accepted that you're going to die. You've made peace with it. And then suddenly, you're not dying anymore. Some people struggled with that transition. They'd organized their entire identity around being terminally ill, and now they had to figure out how to live again. There's an interview with a man who was diagnosed with AIDS in 1990 and started antiretroviral therapy in 1996. He describes the first few years after starting treatment as deeply disorienting. He'd said goodbye to everyone, quit his job, spent all his money on things he wanted to do before he died. And then he didn't die, and he had to get a new job, rebuild relationships, figure out what his life was supposed to be now. He says it was a gift, obviously, but also strange, like being resurrected. Let's talk about how American culture dealt with death in the late 20th century, because it became increasingly sanitized and removed from everyday life. For most of history, people died at home, surrounded by family. Bodies were prepared by family members. Funerals were held in homes or churches. Death was visible, communal, participatory. But by the late 20th century, most people died in hospitals or nursing homes. Bodies were handled by professionals. Funerals were held in funeral homes designed to look like living rooms, with the body made up to look alive. Death became something that happened out of sight, managed by experts, hidden from view. This had some benefits. People didn't have to deal with the physical realities of death, the body cooling, rigor mortis setting in, the smell. It was cleaner, easier. But it also meant that death became foreign, terrifying in its unfamiliarity. People didn't know how to be around dying people, what to say, what to do. The old acceptance rituals, sitting with the dying, preparing the body, communal mourning, these disappeared. And nothing really replaced them. So people were left alone with their grief, unsure how to process it, how long they were allowed to mourn when they were supposed to move on. The hospice movement emerged partly in response to this, trying to bring back some of the old values, death at home when possible, focus on comfort rather than aggressive treatment, family involvement in care. But it was swimming against the tide of a culture that wanted to deny death altogether. There's a book by a hospice nurse from the 1990s where she describes the resistance she'd encounter from families. They'd wait until the very last minute to call hospice, because calling hospice meant admitting their loved one was dying, and they didn't want to admit that. So people would die in ICUs, hooked up to machines, surrounded by strangers, instead of at home with family, because families couldn't accept that death was coming. The quiet acceptance of earlier eras, for all its problems, at least allowed people to die peacefully. The modern denial of death often meant people died badly, fighting against the inevitable with medical interventions that prolonged suffering without actually preventing death. We should talk about how poverty and race affected disease and death in the late 20th century, because the conquest of infectious disease was never universal. Middle-class white Americans largely stopped worrying about infectious disease after the 1960s, but poor communities, especially Black and Hispanic communities, continued to face high rates of tuberculosis, infant mortality, preventable diseases. This wasn't natural or inevitable. It was the result of policy choices, underfunded public health systems, lack of access to health care, environmental hazards concentrated in poor neighborhoods. The quiet acceptance of these disparities by mainstream America is one of the uglier aspects of this period. People knew that Black infant mortality was twice as high as white infant mortality, but there wasn't widespread outrage or urgency about fixing it. It was just accepted as the way things were. Not plague killing indiscriminately, but structural inequality killing predictably. And the communities experiencing these deaths had their own forms of acceptance and resistance. Churches providing support networks, community health workers filling gaps in the medical system, activists fighting for environmental justice and better healthcare access. It's a different kind of quiet endurance, not accepting death as God's will or natural order, but surviving within an unjust system while working to change it. There's an oral history project with Black mothers in Chicago in the 1980s who'd lost children to preventable causes: asthma exacerbated by poor housing, lead poisoning, lack of prenatal care. They describe a kind of doubled grief. Grief for their children, obviously, but also grief mixed with anger at a system that didn't value their children's lives enough to prevent these deaths. One mother says she felt like she was living in a different country than white Americans. They worried about stranger danger and college admissions. She worried about whether her son could breathe through another asthma attack, whether the pipes in her apartment were poisoning her daughter with lead. Different realities, different fears, different acceptances. Let's talk about the rise of lifestyle and preventive medicine in the late 20th century, because it changed how people thought about health and death. The idea emerged that you could largely control your health through lifestyle choices. Eat right, exercise, don't smoke, manage stress. Do all this and you'll avoid disease and live a long, healthy life. This was empowering in some ways. People did have more control over their health than ever before. The evidence was clear that smoking caused cancer, that exercise prevented heart disease, that nutrition mattered. But it also created a new kind of moral judgment around illness. If disease was preventable through good choices, then getting sick meant you'd made bad choices. You deserved it, on some level. This is exactly the kind of thinking that had faded away in the early 20th century, as germ theory proved that disease wasn't about moral failing. But it came roaring back in a new form. People who got lung cancer were asked, "Did you smoke?" People who had heart attacks were asked about their diet and exercise. People with diabetes were assumed to have eaten too much sugar. Sometimes these assumptions were accurate. Often they weren't. Plenty of people get lung cancer without smoking, heart disease, despite healthy habits, type 1 diabetes with no lifestyle component. But the narrative was powerful. You were responsible for your own health. If you got sick, you'd failed somehow. This created a new kind of suffering. Not just the physical suffering of disease, but the shame and guilt of believing you'd caused your own illness. The quiet acceptance of earlier eras said disease was random, God's will, natural. You weren't to blame. But the modern framework said you were absolutely to blame, which made it harder to find peace with illness. There's a memoir by a woman who got breast cancer in her 40s in the 1990s. She describes how many people asked her what she thought had caused it. Did she use antiperspirant? Eat too much soy? Not breastfeed long enough? Too much stress? Everyone had a theory about what she'd done wrong, which meant everyone was implying that if she just made better choices, she wouldn't be sick. She writes about how crushing this was. She was already dealing with cancer and treatment. And on top of that, she had to deal with the implication that she'd somehow failed at the basic task of keeping herself healthy. The old acceptance would have said, "These things happen." The modern framework said, "You should have prevented this." Let's talk about how the internet changed how people deal with illness, because it introduced a whole new dimension of information, overload, and community. Before the internet, if you got diagnosed with a serious illness, you relied on your doctor for information. Maybe you'd go to the library, read some medical texts, but mostly you trusted your doctor and followed their advice. The internet changed everything. Suddenly, you could research your condition obsessively, read medical journals, find experimental treatments, connect with other patients. This was empowering for some people. They became experts in their own conditions, advocated for better treatment, made more informed decisions. But for others, it was overwhelming and anxiety-inducing. You'd fall down rabbit holes of rare complications and worst-case scenarios. You'd second-guess your doctor constantly. You'd try unproven treatments based on anecdotes from strangers online. The quiet acceptance of doctors' orders was replaced by frantic searching for alternatives, for hope, for someone who could promise a better outcome. And online patient communities became sources of support and shared experience. People found others dealing with the same rare conditions, shared coping strategies, mourned together when community members died. There's a forum for parents of children with a specific rare genetic disorder that's been active since the late 1990s. Reading through the archives is heartbreaking. Parents supporting each other through diagnoses, treatments, deaths, celebrating milestones that healthy children would reach easily, but their children might never reach. And the quiet acceptance, there is different again. It's informed acceptance. These parents know the statistics, the prognosis, the likely outcomes, and they choose to hope anyway, to fight for their children, to find joy in whatever time they have. It's not the fatalistic acceptance of earlier eras. It's eyes wide open, choosing to live with uncertainty and probable loss. We need to talk about the opioid crisis, because it's been killing more Americans annually than car accidents. And the response has been a mix of panic, denial, and gradual acceptance that we've created this problem ourselves. Opioid overprescription started in the 1990s with the idea that pain was undertreated and that new formulations of opioids were safe and non-addictive. Both of these ideas were wrong, but they were heavily promoted by pharmaceutical companies. Within a few years, millions of Americans were addicted to prescription opioids. When prescriptions got harder to obtain, people turned to heroin and then to fentanyl, which is so potent that tiny amounts can be fatal. The death toll has been staggering. Over 70,000 Americans died of drug overdoses in 2019, most of them opioid-related. That's more than died in car accidents, from guns, from AIDS at its peak. And the response has been complicated. There's stigma, obviously. The idea that addicts chose this, that they're weak, that they deserve what they get. The same old moral framework that makes it hard to have compassion for suffering we think is self-inflicted. But there's also growing recognition that this is a public health crisis, not a moral failing. That addiction is a disease, that people need treatment, that we've created this problem through overprescription and lack of mental health support. The families dealing with addiction and overdose deaths face a particular kind of grief. They often can't talk openly about how their loved one died because of the stigma. They blame themselves, should have seen the signs, should have intervened sooner, should have done something different. And there's often a cycle of hope and despair. Their loved one gets clean, and they think maybe this time it'll stick. And then there's a relapse, and they have to decide whether to keep helping or practice tough love and create boundaries. And then sometimes the person dies, and they're left wondering if a different choice might have saved them. There's an organization for parents who have lost children to overdose, and their stories are gutting. Parents describing finding their child dead. The guilt, the anger, the desperate wish that they could go back and do something differently. And the quiet acceptance comes, if it comes at all, very slowly. It's not the acceptance of earlier eras, God's will, nothing we could do. It's more like, we did the best we could with impossible circumstances, and it wasn't enough, and we have to find a way to live with that. Let's bring this toward the present and talk about how COVID-19 brought epidemic disease back to American consciousness in a way nothing had since 1918. For most Americans alive in 2020, epidemic disease was theoretical. Something you read about in history books, or that happened in other countries. Not something that would shut down society, kill people you knew, dominate every aspect of life for years. The initial response was panic, which makes sense. Nobody alive had experienced anything like this. But what's interesting is how quickly some people tried to return to the quiet acceptance of earlier eras. People die. That's life. We can't hide from death forever. The vulnerable should accept their fate and let the rest of us live normally. Except it didn't work, because modern Americans don't actually know how to do quiet acceptance. We've lost the cultural frameworks that made it possible. The religious faith that made people accept death as God's will, that's faded for many people. The sense of fate or natural order, we don't believe in that anymore. We believe in human agency, in controlling outcomes, in fighting back. So instead of acceptance, we got division. Fights over masks and vaccines and lockdowns. Arguments about whether deaths were acceptable sacrifices for economic normalcy. Conspiracy theories about the virus being fake or exaggerated. Everyone was trying to make sense of mass death with no shared framework for doing so. The health workers dealing with the actual dying faced their own version of the quiet horror that plague doctors and Civil War nurses experienced. Overwhelmed hospitals, patient after patient dying, despite their best efforts, bodies stacking up. There are interviews with ICU nurses from 2020-2021 that sound eerily similar to accounts from 1918. The exhaustion, the trauma of watching so many people die, the moral injury of not being able to save everyone, and the coping mechanism was often the same: emotional shutdown. You can't feel the full weight of every death or you'll collapse. So you compartmentalize. You focus on the next patient. You keep going. One nurse describes holding an iPad so a dying patient could say goodbye to family over video call because the family couldn't visit in person. She did this dozens of times, sometimes multiple times in a shift. She says she felt like a death attendant, which was exactly what plague nurses and hospice workers throughout history have been. Just present with people in their final moments, offering what comfort you can, bearing witness. We're in this strange moment now where Americans are trying to return to pre-COVID normal, but we've been changed by the experience of epidemic disease. Some people are more anxious about illness, more aware of vulnerability, more cautious. Others have swung the opposite direction, rejecting any precautions, insisting on absolute normalcy, angry at any reminder of the pandemic. And we haven't really processed it collectively. There's no national memorial, no shared mourning ritual, no consensus about what the pandemic meant or what we should learn from it. People are just trying to move on, which is very American. Don't dwell, don't process, just push forward. But the grief and trauma are still there under the surface. 1 million Americans died. Millions more lost loved ones, or got long COVID, or experienced trauma as healthcare workers or essential workers. That doesn't just disappear because we're tired of thinking about it. The quiet acceptance of earlier eras was sustained by shared cultural frameworks, religious faith, community support, collective rituals. We don't have those anymore, at least not universally. So we're each left to process pandemic trauma individually, which is isolating and inadequate. Maybe new frameworks will emerge. Maybe we'll develop new ways of accepting and processing collective loss. Or maybe we'll just bury it and move on, the way we did with the 1918 flu, and let the unprocessed trauma express itself in other ways. Let's talk about what we've lost and what we've gained by moving away from the quiet acceptance of death that characterized most of human history. What we've lost: the ability to sit with death without panic or denial, shared rituals and frameworks for processing grief, the comfort of faith-based acceptance for many people, the humility that comes from recognizing human limits, the resilience that comes from enduring what can't be changed, what we've gained. Dramatically longer, healthier lives for most people, the expectation that children should survive to adulthood, medical treatments that actually work, the belief that suffering can and should be reduced, the refusal to accept preventable death. Both lists are real. Both matter. The quiet acceptance of earlier eras helped people cope with unavoidable suffering, but it also sometimes prevented people from fighting against suffering that could be avoided. The modern refusal to accept death has driven amazing medical progress. But it's also created anxiety, denial, and inability to cope when death inevitably comes. Maybe the ideal is somewhere in the middle, fighting against preventable death while accepting inevitable death, using medical technology to extend life when it improves quality of life, but accepting death when fighting it only prolongs suffering. But getting to that balance requires wisdom that we're still figuring out. There's a conversation I want to highlight from a palliative care doctor's memoir. She describes talking to a patient in his 80s who had terminal cancer. The patient had lived through polio epidemics as a child, lost a sibling to tuberculosis, served in World War II. He'd seen plenty of death. When she asked him how he felt about dying, he said he was ready. He'd had a good life, longer than many people got. He'd seen his children grow up, met his grandchildren. He was in pain and tired of fighting. He wanted to stop treatment and focus on comfort care for his remaining time. The doctor said, "Fine, that makes sense. We can arrange that." But his children were furious. They wanted him to keep fighting, to try more treatments, to not give up. They'd grown up in an era when medicine could cure most things, when fighting was always the right choice. They couldn't understand their father's acceptance. The generational divide there is profound. The father had the quiet acceptance of someone who lived with death all his life. The children had the fighting spirit of people who'd been taught that death was always worth fighting. Both perspectives are valid. Both come from real experiences. The father eventually convinced his children to respect his wishes, but it required weeks of family meetings and grief counseling. And the doctor says this scene plays out constantly in hospitals. Older patients ready to die, younger family members not ready to let them go. The loss of cultural frameworks for accepting death means we have to negotiate it individually, family by family, case by case, which is exhausting. All right, we're going to start wrapping up here, but I want to talk about what the long history of plague and quiet acceptance teaches us. First, humans are incredibly resilient. We've survived wave after wave of epidemic disease that killed huge percentages of populations. We've buried our children, lost our parents, watched communities collapse, and we've kept going. That resilience isn't about being strong or tough. It's about adapting, finding meaning, supporting each other, and accepting what can't be changed while changing what can be changed. Second, how we cope with death is culturally specific, not universal. The quiet acceptance of medieval peasants, Victorian parents, 1918 flu survivors, these were learned behaviors, supported by cultural frameworks. They're not natural or inevitable. We can choose what frameworks we want to build for coping with death in the modern era. We don't have to go back to fatalistic acceptance, but we also don't have to deny death entirely. Third, inequality in who dies and who survives has always been a feature of epidemic disease, not a bug. The rich have always had better survival rates, better nutrition, better housing, better medical care, ability to flee epidemics. This isn't natural or acceptable. It's a choice we make as a society, and we could choose differently. Fourth, medical progress is real and valuable, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem of human mortality. We're all going to die eventually. Medicine can push that death further into the future and make it less painful, but it can't eliminate it, which means we still need frameworks for accepting and processing death, even in an era of medical miracles. Let me tell you one more story before we finish. There's a cemetery in rural Vermont with graves dating back to the 1700s. If you walk through it, you see the patterns we've been talking about. Rows of tiny headstones from the 1700s and 1800s, children who died of diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, all buried within days or weeks of each other during epidemics. Then you see the pattern change in the early 1900s. Fewer child graves, more adults who lived into their 70s and 80s. By the late 1900s, almost no children. Most people living into their 80s or 90s. The physical landscape of death, documented in stone. And what strikes me is that each of those graves represents someone who had to accept their death, or whose family had to accept losing them. Each one is a story of grief, coping, endurance. The quiet acceptance we've been talking about isn't abstract. It's buried in thousands of cemeteries across America. Millions of individual instances of people facing death and finding some way to bear it. We're not facing quite the same deaths anymore, thank God. But we're still facing death, still searching for ways to accept it, still figuring out how to keep living while knowing we'll die. The methods change, the cultural frameworks change, but the fundamental human challenge remains the same. So here we are, at the end of this very long journey through American plague history. We've covered smallpox decimating indigenous populations in the 1500s, through COVID killing 1 million Americans in the 2020s. We've talked about cholera, yellow fever, tuberculosis, influenza, polio, AIDS, and a dozen other diseases that shaped American history. And through it all, we focused on how people faced death, not with panic or drama, usually, but with quiet endurance. Because that's how humans actually cope with ongoing catastrophe, not with grand gestures, but with small, daily acts of survival and care. We've lost some of that quiet acceptance in the modern era and gained other things, longer lives, better health, real medical progress. Whether that's a good trade-off depends on your perspective, and maybe the answer is that we need to find a new balance. Fighting death when we can, accepting it when we must, and having the wisdom to know the difference. That's probably a good place to end. Thanks for sticking with this. I know it's been long and dark, and probably not exactly what you expected when you thought about medieval plagues in America. But history isn't actually dramatic most of the time. It's just people living and dying and trying to make sense of it all. And that's worth documenting, worth remembering, worth sitting with quietly. Get some rest. You've earned it. The forgotten plague's all right, so I thought we were done. But there are actually a few more things worth talking about. Some diseases and stories that didn't quite fit into the main narrative, but deserve their own space in this very long meditation on death and acceptance. So settle back in. We're going to drift through some of the overlooked plagues, the ones that didn't make headlines, but still killed steadily and quietly for centuries. Let's start with dysentery, because because it's one of the most consistent killers in American history, and nobody ever talks about it. Dysentery is basically severe diarrhea caused by bacteria or parasites. It causes bloody stool, dehydration, fever, and in severe cases, death. It's caused by contaminated water or food, which means it was everywhere in pre-modern America. Frontier settlements, military camps, immigrant ships, tenements, anywhere people lived in crowded conditions with poor sanitation. Dysentery was killing people. It's called the bloody flux in historical records, and it killed more soldiers in the American Revolution than combat did. Same with the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War. Every military conflict, dysentery was there, quietly killing young men who'd never even seen battle. The treatment was useless, of course. Doctors would give patients opium to stop the diarrhea, which sometimes helped with symptoms, but didn't address the infection. They'd do bloodletting, which actively made things worse. They'd recommend various dietary restrictions that didn't matter. Mostly, patients would either recover on their own or die within a few days to a few weeks. And people accepted it as just one of those things that happened. You drank bad water, you got the flux. You either got better or you didn't. No drama, no blame. Just another way the world could kill you. There's a diary entry from a woman traveling west on the Oregon Trail in the 1850s. She describes her husband getting dysentery and dying within 3 days. She buried him by the side of the trail, marked the grave with a crude wooden cross, and kept going because the wagon train couldn't wait. That's it. A few sentences about her husband's death, and then entries about the weather and whether they'd find water for the animals. Not because she didn't care, but because what else was there to say? People died on the trail. You mourned quickly and moved on, or you'd die too. The quiet acceptance of the Oregon Trail pioneers is particularly stark. They knew going in that probably 10% of them would die along the way. Disease, accidents, exposure, it was all part of the deal. And they went anyway, because the promise of land and a new life was worth the risk. That calculation, accepting likely death for a chance at a better future, is something modern Americans rarely face. We've mostly eliminated the likely death part of the equation. Let's talk about typhoid fever, because it deserves more attention than it usually gets. Typhoid is caused by bacteria in contaminated food or water, and it causes high fever, abdominal pain, rose-colored spots on the chest, and in severe cases, intestinal perforation and death. It was endemic in American cities throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Every summer, typhoid cases would spike as water sources got contaminated and food spoiled in the heat. The mortality rate was around 10 to 20%, which meant most people survived, but enough died to make it a major public health problem. And here's the thing about typhoid. You could carry the bacteria without getting sick and spread it to other people. Typhoid Mary Maloney is the famous example, an Irish immigrant cook in New York who was an asymptomatic carrier and infected dozens of people, killing several. The authorities eventually quarantined her on an island for the rest of her life, which raises all kinds of ethical questions about individual liberty versus public health. But beyond Mary Maloney, there were probably thousands of asymptomatic carriers walking around, spreading typhoid without knowing it. This created a new kind of anxiety. You couldn't just avoid sick people. You could get infected by someone who looked perfectly healthy. The response in many households was fatalistic acceptance. You did your best, tried to drink clean water, avoid suspicious food. But ultimately, if you were going to get typhoid, you were going to get typhoid. There's a letter from a mother in Philadelphia in 1898 whose daughter died of typhoid. She writes that they'd been so careful, boiled their water, avoided street vendors. But her daughter got sick anyway, probably from ice cream at a church social. The mother describes watching her daughter's fever climb, the characteristic rose spots appearing on her chest, the delirium, the slow decline over 2 weeks, and finally death. And then she writes, almost as an aside, that at least they'd had her baptized, and she was with God now. That little turn to religious comfort at the end, it's in so many letters from this period. The suffering is real and described in detail. But then, there's this pivot to acceptance through faith. It's a coping mechanism that worked for millions of people. I don't know if it made the grief easier, but it at least gave it a framework. We should talk about pellagra, because it's a disease of poverty and malnutrition that killed thousands of Americans well into the 20th century, and most people have never heard of it. Pellagra is caused by niacin deficiency, usually due to a diet too heavy in corn and lacking in meat, beans, and vegetables. It causes skin lesions, diarrhea, dementia, and death, the 4 Ds. It was endemic in the rural South in the early 1900s, particularly among poor sharecroppers and mill workers who lived on cornmeal, molasses, and not much else. People would develop the characteristic skin lesions, rough, scaly patches that looked like burns. Then the diarrhea would start. Then the mental symptoms, confusion, depression, hallucinations. And because people didn't understand the nutritional cause, they thought it was contagious, or hereditary, or a punishment for sin. So pellagra victims were often isolated, shunned by their communities, hidden away by ashamed families. The suffering was compounded by stigma and misunderstanding. It wasn't until the 1930s that a doctor named Joseph Goldberger definitively proved that pellagra was caused by diet, not infection. He ran experiments where he induced pellagra in prisoners by feeding them deficient diets, then cured it by adding meat and vegetables. Once the cause was known, pellagra became easily preventable. Enrich cornmeal with niacin, encourage dietary diversity, and the disease disappears. And it largely did by the 1940s. Pellagra went from killing thousands annually to being almost non-existent in the United States. But for the decades when it was ravaging the South, people just endured it. Families would care for relatives with pellagra, even as they developed dementia and became violent or delusional. There was no treatment, no cure, just slow decline into madness and death. There's an oral history interview with a woman from rural Georgia who remembers her grandmother dying of pellagra in the 1920s. She describes her grandmother's skin cracking and bleeding, her confusion and fear, her eventual death in a state of complete dementia. The family buried her quickly and didn't talk about it much because there was shame around pellagra. It meant you were poor, that you couldn't feed your family properly. That combination of physical suffering and social stigma is particularly cruel. Not only are you dying, but you're blamed for it. Let's talk about hookworm, because it's another poverty disease that shaped the American South and is largely forgotten now. Hookworm is a parasitic worm that lives in soil contaminated with human feces. It enters the body through bare feet, travels to the intestines, and feeds on blood. Chronic infection causes anemia, fatigue, stunted growth in children, and cognitive impairment. In the early 1900s, hookworm infected millions of people in the rural South. Estimates suggest up to 40% of people in some areas were infected. And here's the thing, hookworm was entirely preventable. Shoes and basic sanitation, outhouses that kept feces away from living areas, would eliminate it. But poor rural Southerners often couldn't afford shoes, and many homes didn't have outhouses. So children grew up barefoot, playing in contaminated soil, getting infected with hookworm. They'd be chronically anemic and fatigued, which meant they couldn't work or study effectively, which kept them in poverty, which meant they couldn't afford shoes or sanitation improvements, which meant their children would get hookworm too. It was a cycle of poverty and disease reinforcing each other. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission launched a massive public health campaign in the 1910s to eliminate hookworm in the South. They provided treatment, built outhouses, distributed shoes, educated people about prevention. And it worked. Hookworm rates plummeted. Children's growth and cognitive development improved. The economic impact was measurable. Areas that eliminated hookworm saw increases in productivity and education. But before that intervention, families just lived with it. They accepted that their children would be pale, weak, and tired. They accepted the term lazy Southerner as a stereotype, not realizing it was partly a symptom of parasitic infection. The quiet acceptance of hookworm is particularly tragic because it was so preventable. A pair of shoes would have prevented infection, but poverty made even that impossible for many families. There's a photograph from a rural health clinic in Alabama in 1912 showing dozens of children lined up for hookworm treatment. They're all barefoot, all pale and thin, many with the characteristic pot-bellied appearance of severe hookworm infection. They look like famine victims, but this was America in the 20th century. They weren't starving, they were being slowly bled dry by parasites, and their parents brought them to the clinic, not with any expectation of miracle cure, but with the same quiet hope that characterized so much of medical care in this era. Maybe this will help, and if it doesn't, at least we tried. We need to talk about puerperal fever, or childbed fever, because it killed so many women in childbirth, and the acceptance of maternal death is its own special horror. Puerperal fever is a bacterial infection of the reproductive tract after childbirth, usually caused by doctors or midwives introducing bacteria during delivery. Before antiseptic practices became standard, maternal mortality rates were staggering. In some hospitals in the mid-1800s, 1 in 10 women who gave birth died of puerperal fever. 1 in 10. And women knew this. They knew that childbirth might kill them. But they got pregnant anyway, because what choice did they have? Birth control was limited or non-existent. Abortion was dangerous and illegal, and marital sex was expected. So women faced childbirth knowing it was potentially a death sentence. The acceptance required for that is almost unimaginable. Imagine being pregnant, knowing there's a 10% chance you'll die in childbirth, and just proceeding anyway. Many women wrote goodbye letters to their children before going into labor, just in case. They'd prepare everything for their own potential death, arrange care for existing children, give instructions for the baby, make peace with God. And then they'd give birth and either survive or die. There's a collection of letters from women in the 1700s and 1800s written just before childbirth. They're heartbreaking. Women saying goodbye to their children, expressing love for their husbands, asking forgiveness for any wrongs. Just matter-of-factly preparing for death at age 25 or 30, because childbirth was that dangerous. And if they died, their families would mourn. The husband would remarry, often within months, because who else would care for the children and run the household? And everyone would move on. Because what else could you do? The quiet acceptance of maternal death is particularly brutal because it was so preventable. Ignaz Semmelweis proved in the 1840s that hand-washing dramatically reduced puerperal fever. But doctors resisted because they found it insulting to suggest their hands might be dirty. So women kept dying for decades after the solution was known, because of medical pride and resistance to change. That's a different kind of acceptance, not accepting the unavoidable, but accepting the preventable because the people in power won't act. Eventually, antiseptic practices did become standard, and maternal mortality dropped dramatically. But not before countless women died unnecessarily. Let's talk about ergot poisoning, which is a weird one but worth mentioning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. If infected grain is made into bread and eaten, it causes ergot poisoning, which has 2 forms. Convulsive ergotism causes seizures and hallucinations, and gangrenous ergotism causes extremities to become necrotic and fall off. Both are horrifying. Ergot poisoning happened periodically in colonial America, usually after wet growing seasons that favored fungal growth on grain. Whole villages would be affected. People would have seizures, see visions, experience burning sensations in their limbs, or their fingers and toes would turn black and gangrenous and have to be amputated, or would just fall off on their own. And nobody knew what was causing it. They thought it was demonic possession, or God's judgment, or bad air. The Salem witch trials in 1692 might have been partly caused by ergot poisoning. Some historians think the bewitched girls who had seizures and hallucinations might have been suffering from convulsive ergotism. Whether that's true or not, ergot poisoning was a real problem that people dealt with by calling it whatever made sense in their worldview and trying to endure. If your fingers turned black and fell off, you accepted it as God's will or the devil's work, and you adapted to life without fingers. The quiet acceptance of random, inexplicable suffering is maybe the darkest thread in all of this. At least with understood diseases like smallpox, you knew what you were dealing with. But with something like ergot poisoning, you had no idea why this was happening or how to prevent it. You just suffered and hoped it would pass. We should talk about rabies, because while it didn't kill huge numbers of people, the deaths it caused were absolutely terrifying. Rabies is a viral infection spread through animal bites, usually from dogs or wild animals. Once symptoms appear, it's almost always fatal. You develop hydrophobia, fear of water, along with anxiety, confusion, agitation, and eventually paralysis and death. And it's a horrible death. The patient is aware and terrified as their brain deteriorates. Before the rabies vaccine was developed in the 1880s, a bite from a rabid animal was effectively a death sentence. You'd wait weeks or months for symptoms to appear, knowing that once they did, you'd die horribly. The psychological torture of that waiting period is hard to imagine. Every headache, every odd sensation, is this it? Are symptoms starting? Some people committed suicide rather than face death from rabies. Others just waited and prayed. The quiet acceptance of rabies was different from other diseases because of that long incubation period. You had time to prepare, time to say goodbye, time to make arrangements. But you also had time to dread what was coming. There's an account from a farmer in Pennsylvania in the 1870s who was bitten by a rabid dog. He wrote in his journal for the 2 months between the bite and the appearance of symptoms. At first, he's hopeful that maybe the dog wasn't actually rabid. Then he's resigned. If it was rabid, there's nothing to be done, so he might as well keep working. Then symptoms start. The hydrophobia, the agitation. His last few entries are barely legible, just scattered words about fear and pain. His wife finished the journal with an entry about his death, written in her neat handwriting below his chaotic scrawl. The contrast between her calm documentation and his terror is heartbreaking. Let's talk about tetanus, because it was another disease that killed in particularly horrible ways. Tetanus is caused by bacteria that enter the body through wounds. It causes muscle spasms that can be so severe they break bones. The characteristic symptom is lockjaw, the jaw muscles spasm and lock shut. Before the tetanus vaccine, any deep wound could potentially cause tetanus. Stepping on a rusty nail, cutting yourself on farm equipment, even just a deep scratch. And once symptoms started, there was no treatment. The patient would have increasingly severe muscle spasms, eventually affecting breathing muscles, leading to suffocation, all while fully conscious and aware. The acceptance required to face that kind of death is extraordinary. Patients would know what was happening, know it was getting worse, know they were going to die by essentially being crushed by their own muscles. And there was nothing anyone could do except except give them opium to dull the pain, and hopefully let them drift into unconsciousness before the end. Families would watch their loved ones suffer through this, unable to help, just bearing witness. There's a doctor's account from the 1890s describing a tetanus patient, a boy who'd stepped on a nail. He describes the progression of symptoms over several days, the increasing rigidity, the spasms triggered by any noise or touch, the boy's parents sitting by his bed, trying to keep the room quiet, knowing he was dying, just trying to make it as peaceful as possible. The doctor writes very clinically, documenting symptoms for his medical notes. But at the end, he adds a note that the parents bore their loss with remarkable composure. That composure was the quiet acceptance we keep talking about. Not because they didn't care, but because they'd learned that this was how the world worked, and falling apart wouldn't help anyone. We need to talk about the diseases that affected enslaved people specifically, because their experience of disease and death was shaped by the particular cruelties of slavery. Enslaved people faced all the same diseases as everyone else: malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, tuberculosis. But they also faced worse living conditions, worse nutrition, and medical neglect or experimentation. Malaria was particularly devastating in the plantation South. Enslaved people working in rice paddies and swamps were constantly exposed to mosquitoes. They'd get malaria repeatedly, chronic infections that weakened them over time. Enslavers saw this as acceptable losses. Some enslaved people died, but the plantation was still profitable overall. There's a plantation ledger from South Carolina in the 1820s where the owner notes deaths from the fever in the same column where he notes the purchase of new farm equipment. Just business expenses. The quiet acceptance of their own death that enslaved people had to maintain is unimaginable. They couldn't fight back, couldn't flee in most cases, couldn't even fully express their grief and rage without risking punishment. So they endured. They developed their own medical practices, combining African traditional medicine with what they learned from indigenous people and what they could access from European medicine. They cared for each other when sick, held their own funeral rites, maintained their own concepts of dignity and personhood, even as the system treated them as property. The resilience required for that, maintaining your humanity in a system designed to deny it. Accepting death as part of your forced reality while still fighting to survive. It's a kind of acceptance that deserves recognition. There are slave narratives from people who survived to freedom where they describe watching friends and family die from disease and overwork. They describe it in these very measured, controlled tones because expressing the full horror would be unbearable. One woman describes her mother dying of fever while still being forced to work until she collapsed. The overseer wouldn't allow her to rest. She died in the field and was buried in an unmarked grave. The narrator states these facts without embellishment, without rage, because what good would rage do in the telling? The rage was trapped inside, having nowhere to go. That forced quiet acceptance is different from the acceptance we've been discussing throughout this script. It's not a coping mechanism chosen for its spiritual or practical value. It's acceptance imposed by a system that allowed no other option. Let's talk about diseases of mining and industrial work, because they killed workers steadily throughout American industrialization. Black lung disease, pneumoconiosis, from coal dust in miners' lungs, silicosis from rock dust, lead poisoning in paint factories, mercury poisoning in hat making. That's where Mad as a Hatter comes from. These were all preventable with proper safety measures, but safety measures cost money, so workers just got sick and died. And they accepted it because they needed the work. You knew going into the mines or the factory that it would probably kill you eventually, but you needed to feed your family, so you went anyway. That's a calculated acceptance. Not God's will, but economic necessity. There are oral histories from coal miners in Appalachia from the early 1900s describing watching their fathers and grandfathers die of black lung, coughing up black sputum, struggling to breathe, eventually suffocating, and then going into the mines themselves, knowing the same thing would happen to them. Because what choice did they have? The mine was the only employer. The company owned the town, the store, the housing. If you didn't work in the mine, you starved. So you worked, and you coughed, and eventually you died. The quiet acceptance of workers facing industrial diseases is tinged with class consciousness in a way that earlier acceptances weren't. They knew they were being exploited. They knew the owners could provide safer conditions, but chose not to. So there was acceptance mixed with anger, with solidarity with fellow workers, with occasional attempts at organizing or striking for better conditions. When those attempts failed, and they often did, violently, workers went back to accepting that this was their lot, at least until the next organizing attempt. It's a different kind of endurance, active rather than passive, even though the outcome was often the same. Sick workers, dead workers, families left behind to cope. All right, let's talk about mental illness and how it was understood and treated, because that's been lurking in the background of this whole discussion. For most of American history, severe mental illness was either treated as demonic possession, moral failing, or just inexplicable misfortune. People with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, they were locked away in asylums, often in horrific conditions, or they were cared for by families who had no idea what was wrong or how to help. The acceptance required from families caring for severely mentally ill relatives is its own special burden. You couldn't cure them. You couldn't always understand them. You just had to keep them alive and try to keep them from hurting themselves or others. There are accounts from the 1800s of families keeping mentally ill relatives chained in attics or basements, not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what else to do and couldn't afford institutional care. Just quiet, hidden suffering. The ill relative, isolated and confused. The family, bearing the burden and the shame of having a mad relative. Asylums were supposed to be an improvement, but many of them were just warehouses for people society didn't know what to do with. The quiet acceptance within asylums, patients who'd been there for decades, staff going through the motions of care without real hope of recovery, it's particularly bleak. There's a memoir by a woman who was institutionalized in the 1940s for what was probably bipolar disorder. She describes the routine of the asylum. Wake up, breakfast. Sit in the day room, lunch. Sit in the day room, dinner, bed. Day after day, year after year. Some patients became so institutionalized they couldn't function outside. The asylum became their entire world. She describes the quiet despair of knowing you'd probably spend the rest of your life there, just existing, not really living. She was lucky. She was eventually released and went on to live a relatively normal life. But many patients never left. The acceptance of mental illness as untreatable, of mentally ill people as lost causes, that started to change with the development of psychiatric medications in the 1950s and 60s. Suddenly, some conditions were treatable. People could leave asylums, live in the community, have relatively normal lives. But the acceptance had been so deep, the stigma so strong, that it took decades for attitudes to shift. And we're still working on it. Let's talk about suicide, because it's been a consistent cause of death throughout American history, and it requires its own kind of acceptance from families left behind. Suicide was, and often still is, seen as shameful. A sin, a moral failing, something to be hidden and not talked about. Families who lost someone to suicide often couldn't openly mourn. They'd lie about the cause of death, or have quiet funerals, or just try to move on without processing their grief. The quiet acceptance of suicide deaths is particularly lonely. You can't gather community support the way you could for deaths from disease. You can't find meaning in God's will when the person chose death themselves. So families grieved in isolation, carrying shame and guilt and unanswered questions. There are letters from the 1800s where people allude to a relative's death without stating the cause, using phrases like "by their own hand" or "in a moment of madness." The euphemisms trying to soften something unsoftenable. And the survivors accepting that they'd never fully understand why, never get closure, never be able to talk about it openly. That lonely acceptance, it's still happening today, though we're slowly getting better at talking about mental health and suicide. But for most of American history, suicide deaths were quietly buried in more ways than one. We should talk about alcoholism and how it functioned as both a disease and a coping mechanism for other suffering. Alcohol was everywhere in early America. People drank it because water was often unsafe. They drank to cope with pain, physical and emotional. They drank socially, and some people became alcoholics, which in an era with no understanding of addiction or effective treatment meant they'd drink themselves to death while their families watched helplessly. The temperance movement emerged partly out of women's frustration with watching their husbands drink away their wages while children went hungry. But the quiet suffering of alcoholic families predates the temperance movement by centuries. Families would accept that the husband-father was a drunk. They'd adapt their lives around his drinking, hiding money, managing without him, cleaning up after his binges. It was just another hardship to endure, along with disease and poverty and all the rest. There are diaries from women in the 1800s describing their husband's alcoholism in these very matter-of-fact terms. He came home drunk again. The children were frightened. I put him to bed and did the evening chores. Just documenting reality, accepting it, continuing. Until the temperance movement gave women a framework for saying this wasn't acceptable, that they didn't have to just endure. That shift from quiet acceptance to active resistance is significant. It shows that acceptance isn't inevitable, it's a choice. And when circumstances allow, people can choose differently. All right, let's bring this to an actual close now, because I think we've covered the forgotten plagues and the hidden suffering pretty thoroughly. What strikes me about all these diseases and deaths, we've talked about the major plagues and the quiet killers, the epidemic diseases and the industrial diseases, the physical illnesses and the mental ones, is how much suffering humans have endured and survived. Every single one of our ancestors, going back generations, faced at least some of these diseases. Buried children, lost parents, watched friends suffer, and they kept going. Had more children, rebuilt communities, found joy where they could. That resilience isn't about being tough or strong. It's about the fundamental human capacity to adapt, to find meaning, to keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when everything is terrible. The quiet acceptance we've been talking about throughout this entire script, it was a tool for survival, a way of processing unavoidable suffering without being destroyed by it. We don't need that tool as much anymore, thank God. We've eliminated or controlled most of the diseases that required it. But understanding how our ancestors coped, how they found peace with death, how they supported each other through unimaginable loss, that's worth knowing. Not to romanticize the past, because the past was mostly terrible in terms of health and longevity, but to recognize the depth of human experience, the breadth of suffering that humans have endured, and the quiet dignity with which most people have faced it. That's the story of plague in America. Not just the diseases, but the people who lived through them and died from them and kept going anyway. Sleep well. Remember that you're the product of thousands of generations of survivors who faced diseases we can barely imagine and found ways to endure. And be grateful that you probably won't have to be quite that strong.